The beast was dying on the slab, and the Sethari trauma team was already walking away from it. Ren Halloran stood in the corner of Isolation Bay 4 with a bin of soiled dressings against her hip and watched the last of them go. Chief Overseer Talmec Vihor peeled his surgical membrane off his long gray fingers and dropped it into the reclaimer without breaking stride. His crest, the fan of skin behind his skull that the Sethari could not stop themselves from flushing, had gone the flat ash color they used for waste. Behind him came his two residents, their instrument trays still steaming, their eyes fixed forward the way you fix your eyes when you have decided not to see something. On the slab, the thing they were leaving to die pulled a breath that sounded like a door dragged over gravel, held it too long, and let it go. "Log the write-off," Vihor said. He did not look at Ren when he said it. He looked at the wall, at the specimen board, at the amber line of text that named the animal by its capture tag. Subject Coron 9, non-viable, resource expenditure denied, terminal observation only. He said terminal observation the way a man says nothing further required. "You, contractor, you will note time of cessation and prep the carcass for the incinerator chute. Do not open the restraints. Do not enter the primary field. If it seizes, you let it seize." Ren set the bin down. "Sir, its airways blocked, that's the seizing." "If I clear it." "You will note time of cessation," Vihor said, and now he did look at her, the two black slots of his eyes narrowing to reading width, the way the Sethari looked at a chart that had disappointed them. "It is a war beast, contractor. It has opened 3 of my people to the spine this rotation alone. It is beyond the station's spend authorization and beneath the station's grief. You are here to keep the floor clean. Keep it clean." The bay door iris shut behind them, and their footsteps thinned down the corridor and were gone. And then it was just Ren Halloran, an 1,100 kilos of apex predator, drowning in its own blood in a room the whole station had agreed to forget. She did not move for a moment. That was the honest part, the part she would never tell anyone. She stood with her back to the cold plating, and she looked at the animal, and every good sense she owned told her that Vihor was right, that it was a war beast, that it had killed people who wore the same badge she wore, that clearing an airway on a thing built to remove your arm was how contractors ended up as a line in a safety bulletin. Then it pulled another of those terrible gravel breaths, and its eye rolled and it found her. V. Harkin were not supposed to be beautiful. The Concord field guides called them hazard fauna and rendered them as gray masses of muscle with a threat rating and a kill count. This one was the size of a transport sled, 4-legged, hunched, its hide the color of wet slate and scarred like a map of every fight it had ever survived. A crest of black quills ran from its brow down its spine, most of them broken now, snapped in the netting they dragged it in with. Its forelimbs ended in hands almost 3 thick digits and a hooked thumb, each claw longer than her forearm. There was a collar of restraint foam hardened around its throat, and 2 mag clamps pinning its haunches to the slab and a surgical drape half fallen away from a belly wound. The residents had opened, examined, judged too expensive, and closed with exactly 4 staples before they quit. Its eye was amber, not the flat gold of a lamp. Amber like something with a fire kept low inside it, banked but not out. It looked at her the way a drowning man looks at the shore, and it was not asking her for anything, because it had learned across a lifetime of scars that asking was not a thing that worked. It was simply looking at the last living creature it would see, and it was still, somehow, taking her measure. "Okay," Ren said quietly to the room, to herself, to the animal. "Okay." She crossed the floor. She would think later about how easy it had been to decide once she stopped deciding. She did not open the restraints. Vihor had been right about that much, and she was not a fool. But the restraints were on the body, and the airway was in the throat, above the foam collar, and the throat she could reach. The seizing was fluid. She could hear it, the wet catch at the top of each breath, the way the animal's ribs heaved and got nothing. Blood and edema had filled the upper passage, and it was strangling on the slow tide of its own injuries with its lungs still working underneath, still willing, still fighting. That was the thing that undid her. The lungs would not quit. Somewhere under all that ruin, this animal that the entire station had written off had simply refused to agree with them. Wren went to the supply wall and pulled a long-bore suction line, a hemostatic pack, a warming drape, a bag of the plasma expander the Sethari used on their own soldiers and never on hazard fauna. She snapped a lumen lamp onto her collar. She pulled 2 pairs of the heavy gauntlets the handlers wore, doubled them, because she was calm but she was not stupid. "I'm going to put a hand near your face," she told the V-Harkin, in the low, even voice she used with post-op patients coming up out of sedation frightened and blind. "You're not going to like it. You don't have to like it. But I need you to not take my arm, because if you take my arm I can't finish, and if I can't finish you drown. So, deal." The amber eye tracked her hand. She reached over the foam collar and slid the suction bore into the corner of its jaw, along the shelf of its back teeth, down toward the blocked passage, and the V-Harkin's whole body went rigid, a wall of muscle turning to stone under her, and its lips peeled back off teeth the length of her fingers, and a sound came up out of its chest that she felt in the floor plates, in the roots of her own teeth, a sound with no bottom to it. Wren did not stop. She did not pull back. She had learned that in the wards too, that a frightened thing reads your flinch as proof it was right to be afraid. "I know," she said. "I know I've got you almost." The suction found the block and cleared it in a long, wet pull, and the V-Harkin's next breath went all the way in. It went all the way in, and all the way out clean, and the animal shuddered from crest to tail, with the simple animal relief of a body remembering how to do the one thing it had been failing to do, and the bottomless sound in its chest broke off, and the amber eye came back to her, and this time it was not measuring her. "There you go," Wren said. Her own hands were shaking now, finally, now that the worst of it was done, which was also a thing she'd learned in the wards. "There you go, old man. That's better, isn't it?" 3 floors up, in the night monitoring gallery, a Sethari junior medic named Isfit Kaur watched the whole thing on a feed she was not supposed to be watching. She had pulled up Bay 4 out of a kind of morbid tidiness. The terminal observations were logged automatically, but Isfit liked to confirm the sensors were reading before she signed off the night, and the write-off cases were the ones the system was most likely to get wrong, because a dying animal moved strangely and the motion flags misfired. She had expected to watch a monitor go flat. She had expected, honestly, to feel the small, clean relief of a problem resolving itself, because Coron 9 had come in 3 days ago, having crippled a cargo handler on the intake dock, and the whole ward had been holding a low breath about it since. Instead, she watched the human walk toward it. Isfit's crest went pale and stayed pale. She leaned toward the feed until her breath fogged the panel. She had been on Cairvale for 2 rotations. She had seen exactly what a V-Harkin could do to a Sethari body. She had helped carry the cargo handler's remains into the cold room. And she watched this soft, short-lived contractor, this human with her flat little face and her clumsy 5-fingered hands, walk up to a War Alpha and put a suction bore down its throat while it screamed, and not stop, and not run, and the animal let her. That was the part Isfit could not make sense of. She replayed it twice later when the night was over, and each time she stopped on the same 3 seconds. The moment the V-Harkin's jaw was open and the human's arm was inside the reach of it, fully inside, a single reflexive bite from being gone at the elbow, and the animal chose not to close. Isfit knew predators. Her people were predators. That was the whole architecture of Sethari pride, the long, cold competence of a species that had clawed to the top of its own world and then several others. She knew that a cornered apex did not make merciful choices. Mercy was not in the design. And yet, she did not calm the floor. She told herself it was because Overseer Vihor had gone off shift and would not thank anyone for waking him over a write-off. That was true. It was not the reason. The reason was that Isfit core, 29 cycles old and raised on the certainty that softness was the mark of a lesser make, sat in a dark gallery and watched a human hold a monster's head off the cold metal so its ruined throat would drain, and murmur to it the whole time. And something in the oldest part of her, the part below rank and doctrine, went very quiet and very still and would not tell her what it had understood. The Vharkin did not sleep, and neither did Ren. The clearing of the airway had bought it air, but air was only the first argument. The belly wound the residents had abandoned was seeping under its 4 contemptuous staples, and the plasma pressure the animal was running would not hold a body that size, and there was a deep grinding wrongness in the way it lay that told her something inside was broken and shifting. She could not open the restraints to work. She meant that promise, both to Vihor and to herself. But a body has more than one door, and Ren had spent 4 years learning to work through the doors a patient would allow. She ran a warmed line into the loose skin at the animal's shoulder and let the plasma expander go in slow, watching the amber eye, ready to pull if the muscle so much as tightened. It did not tighten. The Vharkin watched her set the line, watched the bag empty, and after a while the manic edge went out of its breathing, and it lay with its great scarred head flat on the slab and simply let her be near it. She warmed the drape and laid it over the parts of the animal the restraints left bare. She got a wide-mouthed flask of the electrolyte wash the Sethari used, and because the animal could not drink lying pinned, she folded a wound sponge into a wad, soaked it, and pressed it to the corner of that terrible mouth, and let the water run down along the teeth, drop and trickle, over and over, for the better part of an hour. The Vharkin worked its tongue slow and swallowed, and its eye half closed, and it let her. She talked the whole time. She did not know why she talked, except that the ward was very quiet at night, and the animal seemed to settle into the sound of it. She told it about the intake shift, about the cargo handler that everyone said it had crippled, and she told it she didn't hold that against it, because it had been dragged out of a firefight in a net and dropped in a room full of things that smelled like the people who'd shot it, and she'd have taken someone's arm off too. She told it that her name was Ren. She told it she was going to keep calling it Old Man, because Koran 9 wasn't a name. It was a tag, and nobody deserved to die under a tag. Somewhere past the 3rd hour the animal's eye closed all the way, and it slept, and its breathing was deep and even and enormous, filling the whole bay with the slow bellows sound of a thing that had decided, against all the evidence and all the sensible math of the station, to live. Ren sat down on the floor with her back against the slab, inside a hand's reach of a mouth that could have ended her, and she stayed. She stayed through the dead middle of the night when the station's false dawn cycle began to gray the corridor lights. She got up twice to change the wound sponge and re-warm the drape and check the plasma. She logged nothing. The terminal observation field on her slate blinked its patient amber cursor, waiting for a time of cessation, and she left it blank, and every hour it did not fill in was an hour she was going to have to explain, and she knew that, and she stayed anyway. Near the true start of first shift, when the wound had stopped seeping and the animal's color had come up under its scars, the Vharkin woke. It woke all at once, the way the dangerous ones do, no drift, just closed eye and then open eye and the whole mass of it aware. Ren felt it come awake through the slab against her back before she saw it. She got up slow, hands where it could see them, and came around to its head, and the amber eye found her. And for a long moment the animal simply looked at her in the gray light, and something passed between them that Ren did not have a word for and would spend a long time afterward failing to find one. Then the Vharkin did a thing that no field guide in the Concord library had ever recorded. A thing that would, before the week was out, empty a corridor and end a career, and rewrite what 4 species thought they knew about the animal they had been killing for a generation. It lowered its head. Slowly, deliberately, keeping its eye on her the whole way down, the War Alpha that had opened 3 Sethari soldiers to the spine lowered its enormous scarred skull until its brow rested against the flat of Ren Halloran's hand, and it let out a long breath through its nose, and it held there, the whole unbearable weight of its head balanced trusting against her palm, and it waited. "Okay," Ren whispered. Her eyes stung. She turned her hand and laid it flat between the broken quills on the warm slate hide, and she scratched gentle, the way you gentle anything, and the V-Harkin's eye slid closed, and a sound came up out of that vast chest that was nothing like the bottomless snarl from the night before. It was low and rhythmic, and it went on, and it rattled pleasantly in the floor and up through her boots, and it took her a second to understand that the war beast was purring. That was how the first shift found them, an hour later. That was how HFY found them, coming down early with 2 mugs of the burnt Sethari stimulant she'd meant as an apology or an excuse. Coming down because she had not slept either, because she had sat in the gallery all night and could not stop watching, and had finally given up and come to see it with her own eyes. She stopped in the iris of the bay door with a mug in each hand and her crest going through every color it owned, and she looked at the write-off subject purring under a human's palm, and she did not say anything, because there was nothing in her language for it. And that was how Overseer Talmik Vihor found them, 10 minutes after that, striding in to sign a death he had already filed in his mind, his slate raised to log the carcass disposal, and stopping so hard his residents nearly walked into his back, his crest crashing from ash to a violent startled crimson, his mouth open on an order that did not come. "Contractor," he said at last, the word came out cracked, "what have you done?" Ren did not take her hand off the animal's head. She looked at him steadily, this small, ordinary human in a blood-stained contractor's smock, with a War Alpha purring under her palm and a night of insubordination behind her and no fear anywhere in her flat, 5-fingered face, and she said the truest thing she knew how to say. "My job," Ren said. "I kept a patient alive." Overseer Vihor did not raise his voice. Ren would learn that this was the dangerous thing about him. The men who raised their voices on Caravale were the residents and the dock crews and the frightened. Vihor had spent 40 cycles climbing the cold ladder of the Concord Medical Service, and he had learned that the surest way to be obeyed was to speak, as if disobedience had simply not occurred to you. "Step away from the subject," he said. "You will step away, you will surrender your slate, and you will present yourself to station discipline. The airway intervention alone is 3 separate contract violations. The unauthorized plasma expenditure is theft of Concord materiel, and you did not log the write-off." His crest had settled from crimson to a hard, controlled bronze. "That last one interests me most, contractor. You watched a terminal subject and you did not log its cessation, because it did not cease, because you prevented it from ceasing, against a direct order given to you by name. Do you understand that I could have you off this station and off the contract registry by the end of the shift?" "I understand it," Ren said. And it's still alive," she said. "So I'd do it again." HFY, still holding 2 cooling mugs in the doorway, watched the Overseer's residents exchange a look. She knew that look. It was the look of junior people recalculating who was going to survive the next 10 minutes. Vihor took a step into the bay. "Restrain the animal for handling," he said to the residents. "I want it moved to the necropsy dock and terminated properly. The contractor has wasted a night, we will not waste a morning. And log it correctly this time, cessation by station authority, cause, resource reallocation." "Move." The senior resident, a tall Sethari named Drail with a handler's certification, unclipped a control wand from the wall and stepped toward the slab, thumbing the wand to the frequency that fired the mag clamps and the restraint foam. The V-Harkin opened its eyes. It did not lift its head from Ren's hand. That was the thing that HFY would describe, over and over in the weeks after, to anyone who would listen and several who ordered her to stop. It did not lift its head. It simply opened its eyes, and it looked at Drayle, and every quill along its crest that was not already broken rose at once with a dry hiss like a blade drawn slow across stone, and the bottomless sound came back up out of its chest, the one from the night before, the one with no floor to it, and it filled Bay 4 wall to wall and pressed on the ears like depth. Drayle stopped. "It's clamped," Vihor said. "It's pinned to the slab. Fire the restraints and sedate it." "Overseer," Drayle said, and his voice had gone high and thin, "the clamps are rated for a subdued subject." "It is not, sir. Look at it. It is not subdued." "Fire the restraints." Drayle fired the restraints. Later, the maintenance logs would show what the room could not process in real time, that the mag clamps had, in fact, released on command exactly as designed, in order to reset to the higher handling tension. For 1/2 of 1 second the War Alpha was not pinned to the slab. It was simply lying there, unclamped, with a control wand pointed at it, and a room full of the smell of the people who had shot it and netted it and stapled it and left it to drown. It could have gone through all of them. Isvet knew that. Everyone in the room who knew V. Harkin knew that. In a half-second, an unpinned Alpha could have crossed the bay, and there would have been a new entry for the cold room, and a new safety bulletin and Drayle, and the overseer and the junior resident would have been a problem for the disposal crew. Instead, the V. Harkin came up off the slab in a single vast liquid motion, 1,100 kilos moving like water, and it put itself over Wren. Not at Drayle, over Wren. It planted its 4 huge limbs around her where she'd been standing at its head, so that she was underneath the arch of its chest and between its forelegs, roofed by the scarred slate weight of it, and it lowered its head and faced outward at the room, and it snarled. And this snarl was different. Isvet heard the difference. This one had a shape to it, a direction it was aimed, and it took one slow, deliberate step toward Drayle with Wren tucked safe beneath it. And Drayle dropped the control wand and scrambled backward into the supply wall hard enough to bring a tray of instruments down in a bright crash. "Nobody move," Wren said from underneath the animal. Nobody moved. She said it again, softer, and this time she wasn't talking to the room. She reached up from where she was sheltered beneath its chest and laid her palm flat on the underside of the V. Harkin's jaw, and she said, "Easy, easy, old man. They're not going to touch me. Look, nobody's touching me. Easy." And the aimed snarl wound down, degree by degree, the way a turbine spins down, and the animal held its ground over her, quills up, eyes on the room, but the killing edge came off it, because she had told it the threat was managed, and it had decided, against every instinct in its enormous body, to believe her. Vihor stood very still against the far wall with his residents. His crest had gone a color Isvet had never seen on him, a sick grayish-white, the color of a Sethari who has understood something he cannot yet admit. "It is defending the contractor," he said, flatly, as if reading a chart. "Yes," Isvet said, before she could stop herself. Vihor's slot eyes came to her, marking her, filing her. "Kor, you are not on this case." "No, overseer." "Then you will explain why you are standing in a hazard bay, the start of first shift, with beverages." Isvet looked down at the 2 mugs. She looked at the human, still tucked under the arch of a War Alpha's body with her hand on its jaw, keeping it calm, keeping all of them alive, and she made the second choice of her career that she could not have explained to the Sethari she had been a week ago. "I came to assist the contractor," Isvet said. "She was alone with a Class 4 hazard subject all night. That is against station handling protocol. I'm correcting it. They could not terminate the animal. That was the first thing the day made clear, and it made it clear the way the day makes anything clear on a station full of people who answer to charts, through the slow accumulation of facts nobody wanted. Fact, the V. Harkin would not permit any Sethari within 4 meters of Wren. It tracked them by smell, and it tracked them by the sound of their crests, which flushed and rustled when they were afraid, and it had learned in a single night which of the two-legged shapes in the bay was the one it would let touch it, and which were the ones that had brought the net. When Drayle edged toward the door, it turned to follow him. When the junior resident reached for the fallen wand, it took a step, and the resident abandoned the wand. Fact, it would permit Wren to do anything. She walked out from under it, and it let her go, and it watched her the whole way to the supply wall and back. And when she came back and pressed a fresh, warm sponge of electrolyte to its mouth, it drank from her hand in front of all of them, drop and trickle, while the overseer of the whole surgical service stood pinned to a wall by an animal's attention, and could not make his own residents approach. Fact, and this was the one that changed the shape of Vihor's morning. The animal was, by every clinical measure, recovering. Isfit ran the panels because Isfit was the only Sethari the Viharkin would tolerate in the bay at all, and even her only because Wren stood beside her the whole time with a hand on the animal's shoulder, saying, "She's with me, she's fine, she's with me," in that low, even voice, over and over, until the quills went down. The plasma pressure had come up. The belly wound had sealed. The grinding wrongness in its lie had resolved into a cracked floating rib that was already knitting. The write-off subject, the non-viable expenditure, the thing the entire station had agreed to forget, was going to live, and it was going to live strong, and it had decided that the sum total of everything it was willing to live for was one soft, short-lived human with a flat face and clumsy hands who had stayed. Vihor left the bay at mid-morning without terminating anything. He did not announce that he was leaving. He simply reached the point that men like him reach, where the gap between the order they have given and the world's refusal to obey it has grown wide enough to be visible to their subordinates, and he chose to remove himself before the gap could be measured. He told Drayle to seal the bay and post a hazard watch. He told Isfit Kaur that her conduct would be reviewed. He did not look at Wren again, and Wren understood, watching him go, that this was not the end of it. A man does not forgive the animal that made his residents flinch. A man like Vihor does not forgive the contractor who watched it happen. "He's going to try again," Isfit said quietly, when the door had irised shut. She was standing very close to the human now, closer than a Sethari stood to anyone, because the 4 meters of clear space the Viharkin demanded around every other member of the staff had made Wren the only safe place in the room. "He can't leave it like this. You made him small in front of his own people. On this station, that is the one injury we do not heal from." "I didn't make him anything," Wren said. She was checking the Viharkin's rib with the flats of her fingers, and the animal was letting her, its amber eye half shut, its purr going in the floor. "I cleared an airway." "You don't understand us yet," Isfit said. "You will." The Viharkin's name, Wren decided that afternoon, was Kaur. She arrived at it the way she arrived at most things, by paying attention until the answer was obvious. Cora 9 was a tag, and she'd meant every word she'd said in the night about no one deserving to die under a tag, but old man was a thing you called a stranger, and the animal breathing slow under her hand in the sealed bay was no longer a stranger. So she took the first sound of the tag they'd hung on him and she gave it back to him clean, without the number, without the capture code. And the first time she said it, Kaur, testing it, the great head came up off the slab and the amber eye found her and the quills rippled once, flat and easy, and she knew she'd chosen right. "Kaur," she said again and scratched between the broken quills. "Yeah. That's you." Isfit, sitting cross-legged on the floor a careful meter and a half away, the closest the animal would let her sit, made a small sound in her throat. "You named it." "Him." "You named him." Isfit said it like a person testing the temperature of water she'd been told was dangerous. Overseer Vihor will enter that in the review as evidence of unprofessional attachment to a hazard subject. "Let him." Wren sat down against the slab in the spot that had become hers, and Kaur shifted, huge and careful, until his scarred flank was a warm wall against her back and his head was down near her knee where she could reach it. "You know what I keep thinking about? Back home, before I signed the Concord contract, I did 2 years on a burn ward. Human hospital, Earthside, understaffed the way they always are. And there was this thing the old charge nurse used to say to the new ones on their first night when they got scared of a patient who was screaming or fighting or bleeding out and they wanted to back off and wait for a doctor. She used to say, Ren stopped, and her hand went still on Core's crest, and for a second the ward was very quiet. She used to say, nobody dies alone on my floor, not because we can save them all. We can't. But because being with them is the part of the job that's actually ours. The machines do the medicine. The being there, that's the human part. That's the part that's the job. Isfit was silent for a long moment. Her crest, Ren had learned to read it now, cycled slow through a color she hadn't catalogued. We do not have that, Isfit said finally. The being there, it is not a value we hold. On my world, a soldier who cannot be returned to service is a resource that has completed its function. We do not sit with them, we reallocate. That is what strength is to us. The clean cut. She looked at the War Alpha with its head on a human's knee. I have watched you for 1 night and 1 day, contractor, and I think you may have shown a Class 4 apex predator something my whole species does not know how to do. And I think that is why it will not leave you. Not because you healed it. Drail could have healed it, because you stayed. Ren didn't answer. She didn't know how to answer that, so she did the thing she always did when there was nothing to say, which was the next small piece of the work. She reached for the warmed flask, folded a fresh sponge, and pressed it to the corner of Core's mouth, and the War Alpha drank from her hand, drop and trickle, in the sealed and sanctioned dark, and the sound of his purring filled the bay like something that had been missing from the station for a very long time and had only now come home. Neither of them knew that Isfit's phrase, she stayed, had already begun to travel, that the 2 residents who'd fled Bay 4 had told the story on the mess deck, that the dock crew who'd carried in the crippled cargo handler 3 days ago had heard a version of it by second meal, that somewhere in the lower levels of Care Vale, among the contract species and the orderlies and the small overlooked people who did the station's actual work, the thing the human had done for the dying beast was being handed mouth to mouth, and a name was forming around it. 4 blunt words that would be in every corridor by the end of the week and carved over a doorway before the year was out. The hand that stayed. They did not know that yet. In the sealed bay there was only the purr and the low light and the human and the beast, and the long, slow breath of a thing that had decided to live. By the middle of the week, the sealed bay was no longer sealed in any way that mattered. Vihor had posted a hazard watch, as he'd said he would, a rotating pair of station security in the corridor outside Bay 4, armed with the long shock poles the handlers used on intake day. But a hazard watch is only as good as its willingness to go through the door, and the door was the problem. On the second morning of the watch, one of the security officers, a heavy-set Sethari named Oskan who had lost a cousin to a V-Harkin raid and had opinions about the whole affair, decided that the animal had been coddled long enough and that a shock pole across its snout would remind it of the natural order. He got 2 steps into the bay. Ren was not even looking at him when it happened. She was at the supply wall with her back turned, mixing the electrolyte wash, and she heard the quills go up behind her. She knew that dry blade-on-stone hiss now the way you know the sound of your own name, and she turned and said, Oskan, don't. But Core was already moving, and the shock pole was already up, and then the shock pole was on the floor in 2 pieces and Oskan was against the ceiling. Not literally against the ceiling. That was how the story got told afterward on the mess deck, in the lower corridors. The V-Harkin threw him to the ceiling. But what actually happened, what Isfit's incident review recorded from the bay feed, was that Core had caught the descending pole in his jaws, sheared it, and put one 3-fingered hand flat against Oskan's chest and pushed. And Oskan had gone backward through the open iris and skidded the width of the corridor, and come up against the far wall with the wind knocked out of him and not one claw mark on him. The animal had removed him. It had removed him the way you'd sweep a thing off a table you were working at, with exactly as much force as the job required, and not 1 unit more. And then it had turned and put itself between the door and Wren, and waited to see whether the table needed sweeping again. It did not. Osgun did not come back into the bay. Nobody came back into the bay with a pole. He held back, Isfit said, watching the review that evening, her voice low. She had taken to spending her off shifts in the bay now in her careful spot 1.5 meters from the animal, and she had stopped pretending it was for the incident reports. Do you see it, contractor? Osgun came in armed with intent, and Kor took the weapon and removed the threat and did not open him. A wild alpha would have opened him. He is choosing the level of force. That is not fauna behavior. That is a soldier's discipline. He is deciding how much is enough. He's protecting his floor, Wren said. She was at Kor's shoulder, working a comb of soft resin the maintenance shop had printed her through the tangle of his crest, straightening the quills that had healed crooked, and Kor was leaning his great weight into it, eyes half shut. That's all. He decided this is his floor and I'm on it, and he's not going to let anybody bring a weapon onto it. He's not being merciful. He's being a professional. Isfit was quiet. Then she said, "That is what I said." Wren's hands paused in the crest. She looked over at the Sethari medic, at the careful stillness of her, at the crest that had learned in 3 days to cycle its colors slower and softer near the human, and something in Wren's chest went warm and complicated. "Yeah," she said, "I guess it is." The name reached the lower levels first, because the lower levels were where the small people lived, and the small people had understood the story immediately, in a way the surgical service never would. On Care Vale, below the clean decks where the Sethari practiced their cold, competent medicine, there was a whole shadow station of contract species who kept the place running, the threned orderlies with their 6 patient hands, the stocky bulk dock crews, the handful of humans on the medical contract, a scattering of others too few to name. They cleaned the floors the Sethari would not stoop to clean and carried the bodies the Sethari would not carry, and they were, every one of them, a resource that had completed some function on their own worlds and been reallocated out here to the edge of the dark. They knew exactly what it was to be written off. They had all been written off. That was the contract. So when the story came down from the surgical deck, a War Alpha, a Class 4, dying under a Sethari write-off order, and a human contractor who stayed all night with her hand on its chest and would not let it die alone, the small people did not hear a story about an animal. They heard a story about themselves. They heard the one thing none of them had ever been given, which was the promise that somebody would stay. It was a threned orderly named Vash who first said the 4 words aloud, in the lower mess, to a table of dock crew, telling the story with all 6 hands moving. He said the human had done the thing their peoples did not have a word for, and then he found the words, 4 of them, blunt and plain, and the table went quiet. And by the next meal, the whole lower deck had them. And by the day after that they were coming up the lift shafts to the surgical floor the way water finds a crack. The hand that stayed. It was on the lower decks as a saying before it was ever on the upper decks as a problem. When a bulk dockhand crushed 2 fingers unloading a supply barge and his crew chief carried him up to the trauma line, the crew chief said, "Take him to the hand that stayed," and would not be argued out of it. And Wren, who was, technically, only a contract nurse with no authority to run a trauma line, set the fingers anyway because the man was in front of her and hurting, and that was the job. When a threned orderly's shiftmate collapsed with a fever the Sethari triage had ranked as low-priority contract illness and shelved for the next day, the orderly brought her up the back stairs to Bay 4, past the hazard watch that no longer had the heart to stop anyone, and Wren treated her on the floor beside the sleeping War Alpha because there was nowhere else, and Kor lifted his head and looked at the sick threned and then put it back down and let her stay. That was the thing that the surgical service could not forgive and could not understand and could not stop. The bay had become a place where the written-off went to be kept alive by the one nurse who would not write them off, and the War Alpha that guarded her had somehow understood the whole arrangement and made himself its warden. Cor let the sick and the hurt of the lower decks in. He watched them with his banked amber eye, and he read them the way he read everything, for threat, and he found none in them because there was none in them. They were the small people, the reallocated, the ones who came bleeding or feverish and afraid, and the War Alpha had a category for that now, and the category was Wren's, and Wren's was safe. He kept the poles out. He kept the crests flushed with contempt out. But the small people, the frightened ones, the ones who came the way he had come, those he let through the door and stood over while the human worked, and it was the strangest guard duty in the history of the station, an apex predator holding the door of a clinic for the people nobody else would treat. The trouble, when it came, did not come from the surgical service. Wren learned this on the fourth day, from Isvet, who came into the bay at the change of shift with her crest gone the tight bronze of bad news, and did not sit down in her careful spot. "A ship docked this morning," Isvet said. "Military, not Concord medical, Concord defense. There is a field warden aboard, Ossik Vaughn. Do you know that name?" "I don't know any of your names," Wren said. She was changing the dressing on Cor's belly wound, which had knit down to a clean pink seam, and Cor was letting her. His head turned to watch Isvet, quills flat but attention up, reading the Sethari's fear off her the way he read everything. "He is the officer who runs the Frontier Beast Corps," Isvet said. "The V-Harkin that are captured on the raids, the ones that survive intake, they do not stay in medical contractor. They go to Vaughn. He breaks them and he collars them and he fields them. A fielded V-Harkin is worth more than a company of soldiers, and it is worth that precisely because of what it is, because it is a Class 4 Apex that has been made to obey. Vaughn has 40 of them. He came here because Vihor filed a report." Wren's hands went still on the dressing. "Vihor filed a report on Cor. Vihor filed a report on a hazard subject that survived a write-off and displays anomalous handler response," Isvet said, and the flatness in her voice was the flatness of a person quoting words that made her ill. "He could not terminate it. You made that impossible. So he did the next thing a man like Vihor does when a problem embarrasses him. He sold it to someone who could take it away. Vaughn is here to assess Cor for the Beast Corps. If Cor can be handled, Vaughn will collar him and field him, and the report will show that Care Vale turned a write-off into a military asset, and Overseer Vihor will have turned his humiliation into a commendation." She finally sat heavily in her careful spot. "And you will have spent a week keeping an animal alive so that they could put a war collar on it and send it out to die properly the next time on a battlefield, obeying a stranger." Cor had gone very still under Wren's hands. She would swear afterward that he understood not the words, but the shape of the thing, the change in the room, the way Isvet's fear had a new edge to it, and the way Wren's own hands had gone cold. He turned his great scarred head and looked at her, the amber eye steady, and she looked back, and she thought about the collar of restraint foam they'd hardened around his throat on intake, and she thought about 40 of him, 40 War Alphas broken and collared and fielded, and she thought about the phrase Isvet had used on the first night, the clean cut. That is what strength is to us, and something in Wren Halloran that had been patient all week stopped being patient. "No," she said. "Contractor." "No," Wren said again, and she put her hand flat on Cor's brow, and the War Alpha leaned his head into it, all that weight, trusting, and she felt the purr start up low in the floor. "He's not a resource that completed a function, Isvet. He's not an asset. He's a patient on my floor, and he decided to live, and he decided," her voice caught, and she let it, because there was no one here to hide it from. "He decided to live for me. You don't get to collar that. Nobody gets to collar that. I'll go through Vihor, and I'll go through this field warden, and I'll go through the whole Concord if I have to, but they are not putting a collar on him." Isvet looked at her for a long moment. Her crest cycled slow, through the color Wren still had not catalogued, the one she only ever showed in the bay. You are one contract nurse, Isfit said gently. Von commands a fleet. Vihor commands a station. You have no rank, no standing, no authority beyond keeping the floor clean. On paper, Ren, you are nothing at all. I know what I am on paper, Ren said. She turned back to Core and finished the dressing, smoothing the last of the seal down over the healed pink seam, and the War Alpha watched her do it. And when she was done, he did the thing he'd done on the first gray dawn. He lowered his enormous head until his brow rested against her palm, the whole trusting weight of it, and held there and waited. But he doesn't know I'm nothing, Ren said quietly, and neither do the small people downstairs, and I've got a feeling that's going to matter a lot more than the paper does before this is done. She did not know how right she was. She did not know that far out beyond the station, out in the cold, contested dark that the frontier raids swept for beasts, a pack of V. Harkin had spent 4 days moving toward Care Vale on a bearing they could not have read off any chart. She did not know that V. Harkin packs did not abandon a taken Alpha, that the thing the Concord field guides had never recorded, the thing no researcher had ever survived long enough to document, was that when you netted an Alpha and dragged it screaming out of a firefight, you did not remove it from its pack. You gave its pack a heading, and they came. She did not know that Core, lying with his brow against her palm, purring, healing, had known it for 4 days. That the low, even rumble she'd taken for contentment had, underneath it, another frequency, one the station's sensors read as background noise and filed and ignored. That the War Alpha had been calling the whole time, patient, steady, certain, the way he did everything. Calling them home. The surgical service made one more attempt on the bay before the Beast Corps ship ever docked, and it was Drayle who made it, because Vihor had learned by then not to walk through that door himself, and Drayle had not yet learned that some orders are worse to obey than to refuse. He did not come with a pole. He had watched Osgun go across a corridor, and he was not a fool. He came with a requisition slate and the cold logic of a man who has decided to win by paperwork what he cannot win by force, and what he shut off, that pre-dawn, was the supply. Ren found out the way she found out most things, by the work stopping. She reached for a warmed line of the plasma expander to run into a threnod orderly gone gray with blood loss from a reclamation deck accident, and the supply wall gave her nothing. The dispensary lock had been reflagged overnight, the whole bay reclassified from active ward to hazard containment, and a hazard containment did not get plasma, did not get warmers, did not get the electrolyte wash or the seal strips or the suture kits. Did not get anything but the standing order to keep the floor clean. Drayle had not barred the door. He had done something a Sethari administrator understood as cleaner. He had made the room still a room and simply cut off everything that made it a ward, and left Ren standing inside it with a bleeding orderly and empty hands. They can't fault you for a subject that expires in a properly reclassified containment bay, Drayle said, from the safe side of the iris, reading it off his slate in the flat voice of a man who has decided the words are true because they are written down. You have no requisition authority in a hazard classification, contractor. Nothing dies here that the record won't say died correctly. That is the whole point of the record. Ren looked at the orderly going gray on the pallet. She looked at the dark supply wall. And she did the thing she always did when the system in front of her had decided a person was allowed to die, which was to stop asking the system for permission. Isfit, she said, your credentials still clear the dispensary 2 decks down. For another day, Isfit said, until Vihor thinks to pull them. Then go pull everything you can carry before he does. Plasma, warmers, seal, wash. Take the 2 humans off the medical contract to carry the rest. Go now. And Isfit went past Drayle, who did not try to stop a Sethari medic with valid credentials because stopping her would have meant a record of his own. And within the hour the supply wall did not matter, because the small people had understood the problem the instant it was described to them, and had solved it the way the small people solved everything, by hand, up the back shafts. A bulk dockhand with a crate of warmers on each shoulder, and a threned orderly with 6 hands full of seal strips. An underground supply line to a written-off ward, running past a hazard watch that no longer had the heart to log it. Drayle watched a bay he had cut off from the record fill back up with everything it needed, carried by species he had never once had to think about, and he understood dimly that he had lost, and he did not yet understand how completely or why. Core understood. That was the thing Wren caught, working over the gray threned orderly with the plasma the small people had smuggled up the shafts, that the War Alpha had watched the whole bloodless siege with his banked amber eye and had read it exactly. The man at the door with the slate, the supply gone dark, the human's hands gone empty over a dying body. He had not moved. There was no throat to stop at, no pole to shear, no reaching hand to sweep off its feet. There was only a man with a slate deciding, cleanly and legally, to let a room's worth of people die by turning off the things that kept them alive. And the War Alpha, who had come up off a slab a week ago with a spear fan of leveled quills for anyone who brought a weapon onto his floor, seemed to grasp that this was a different kind of weapon, and that the answer to it was not his to give. So he did the only thing he could do. He got up and he crossed the bay, and he lay down along the length of the gray threned orderly's pallet, his enormous warm bulk a wall against the cold of the reclassified room, and he put his head down near the sick creature's shoulder, and he purred steady, low, enormous, and the shivering threned, half-conscious, blood-starved, terrified, felt 1,100 kilos of apex predator arrange itself around him like a banked fire and impossibly stopped shivering. "He's keeping him warm," one of the 2 contract humans said, staring, a crate of smuggled warmers still in her arms. The warmers were the thing they cut off, and he just made himself the warmer. "Yeah," Wren said, and did not look up from the line because her eyes had gone hot and she had a job in front of her. "That's what he does. He figured out what the room's for, took him about a day, took this whole station a lot longer, and some of them still haven't." The threned orderly lived. He lived because a Sethari medic burned the last day of her credentials on a supply run, and because the small people ran a smuggling line up the back shafts to a room the record had abandoned, and because a war beast the hospital had thrown away made himself into the one piece of equipment the administrator had cut off. And when Vihor reviewed the containment logs that morning, expecting to find a subject expired correctly and a contractor with empty hands, he found instead a full ward. A recovered patient and a bay that had simply rooted around him as though he were damage, which, Isvit thought, watching his crest go the sick gray-white in the review gallery, was precisely what he had become. You could cut the supply. You could reclassify the room. You could write the record so that everyone died correctly. And it did not matter, because the thing that kept the written-off alive on Care Vale was no longer anything the record could reach. It was a nurse who would not ask permission, and the small people who carried for her, and a War Alpha who had learned what a room was for, and there was no requisition flag in the whole Concord that shut any of that off. Drayle requested reassignment off the trauma service by midday. He did not, when it came to it, have the stomach to be the man who kept turning things off, and that small remaining decency was the only thing that saved his career, because he got out from under the order before the order got out from under him. Vihor let him go and stood a little more alone and waited for the Beast Corps ship, and told himself that the field warden would bring the force that the paperwork could not, and set his last hope on a collar. Field Warden Ossik Vaughn had collared 31 V. Harkin in his career, and he had never once been afraid, and this offended him about Bay 4 before he ever set foot in it. He was a larger Sethari than the medical staff, broad through the shoulders in the way of soldiers, his crest cropped short in the Beast Corps style so that a raking claw would find no purchase on it. He wore the gray field harness with the collar cache down one thigh, the row of dormant war collars each folded small and waiting, and he walked the surgical corridor with 2 handlers behind him, and a confidence that came from a simple, tested truth. There was no beast he had met that could not be broken, given time, given pain, given the correct application of both. Vihor met him at the bay door, crest flushed the eager bronze of a man expecting to be made whole. Field Warden, the subject is remarkable. A frontier alpha, mature, combat-scarred, it survived a full write-off, which speaks to its constitution, and it displays handler response we've never documented. I believe it represents a significant opportunity for the Beast Corps, and for the station's standing. And the contractor, Vaughn said, he had read the report, he read everything. The one it responds to, a human. Vihor's crest flickered. An irregularity, attachment to a hazard subject. It will be resolved as part of the transfer. The contract can be reassigned or terminated. The animal will retrain to a proper handler. They always do, Vaughn said, or they die on the collar, either outcome serves. He gestured his handlers forward. Open it. The bay door irised, and Field Warden Ossik Vaughn got his first look at Subject Coron 9, and for one moment he would deny for the rest of his career. He understood why the report had been written the way it was. The War Alpha stood in the center of the bay. It was not on the slab. It had not been on the slab in 2 days. It stood clear of the restraints entirely, healed, huge, its slate hide gone glossy with health, its crest combed straight. Someone had combed its crest, raised in a full black fan from brow to tail. And it was not looking at the door, at the soldiers, at the collars. It had positioned itself, with the unhurried certainty of a thing that had done this every day of its life, between the door and a small human female who sat cross-legged on the floor behind it doing something with a slate and a bowl, and it was watching Ossik Vaughn with a banked amber eye that held no fear at all, and no aggression yet, and a patient, terrible, waiting intelligence that Vaughn had seen in exactly 0 of the 31 beasts he had broken. Interesting, Vaughn said, because a field warden does not say what he actually felt, which was a cold finger drawn up the back of his cropped crest. Can I help you? The human said from behind the animal. She did not get up. You are the contractor. Halloran. Vaughn stepped into the bay and both handlers came with him, and behind him Vihor, and further back, hovering in the corridor, the Sethari Junior Medic Corps who had no business here and whose crest was the sick white of dread. I am Field Warden Vaughn. I command the Frontier Beast Corps. I am here to assess this subject for military transfer. You will move away from the animal. It complicates the assessment. His name's Corps, the human said, and I'd stay where you are if I were you. He doesn't like the harness. Vaughn looked at the animal. The animal looked at Vaughn, and the quills, which had been raised in a full fan, did a thing that Vaughn had never seen a fan of V. Harkin quills do. They did not rise higher. They did not flatten. They angled. The whole crest tipped forward, toward him, like 40 spearheads leveling at once, and the dry blade-on-stone hiss ran down the animal's spine, and Ossik Vaughn, who had never once been afraid, felt his handlers stop moving behind him. It's leveled its crest, one of them said low. Sir, I've never seen intake do that. That's a war display. That's what they do to each other, to rivals. I know what it is, Vaughn said, though he did not entirely. He had seen the crest raised in fear and flattened in submission, but he had never once been shown the third thing, the leveled fan. The display in Alpha gave another Alpha, the one that said I see you, and I have measured you, and you are inside my range. Ready a collar. Field Warden, Isvit said from the doorway, and her voice shook, but it did not stop. With respect, the subject's handler response is exclusive. It permits contact only from the contractor. Any attempt to collar it will be read as a threat to the arrangement it is protecting. You will not get a collar on it. You will get a casualty. Medic, Vaughn said without turning, you are not Beast Corps and you are not going to lecture me on the animal I have spent 40 cycles learning. The subject is protecting a resource. I remove the resource, the protection has nothing to defend, and the subject reverts to a manageable state. It is not complicated. He nodded to his handlers. Take the human out. Gently, she's conquered contract, we're not barbarians. Just remove her from the bay. The animal settles the moment she's gone. The handlers moved toward Wren. What happened next happened in under 3 seconds, and HFY spent a great deal of the rest of his life turning it over. The nearer handler got within reach of Wren, not touching her, reaching one gloved hand out to take her arm, and Concord did not snarl, did not roar, did not give the bottomless sound that had emptied the bay on the first morning. He simply moved, and the handler was on the floor. Not thrown, not clawed. The War Alpha had crossed the space and put his enormous body between the reaching hand and the human, and swept the handler off his feet with one turn of his shoulder, the way a door swings shut, and stood over the fallen Sethari with his leveled crest, a hand's breadth from the soldier's face, breathing, waiting, deciding. Everyone in the room could see him deciding how much was enough. And it was, again, exactly enough, and not 1 unit more. The handler was down and disarmed and unmarked, and Concord lifted his head off him and stepped back over Wren and put himself between the whole room and the human once more. And the message could not have been plainer if he had spoken it in Concord standard. Her you do not touch. Concord, Wren said quietly. She was on her feet now, one hand on the War Alpha's flank. Easy, that's enough. He's getting up, see. He's getting up and he's going back to the door. Easy, old man. And the leveled crest came up out of its forward angle degree by degree, and Concord let the handler crawl back to the wall, and the killing readiness bled out of the bay, because the human had said the threat was managed, and the War Alpha had chosen again to believe her. Field Warden HFY looked at the fallen handler, and the untouched human, and the War Alpha standing guard over a soft, short-lived contractor, as if she were the last alpha of a dead pack. And he did the thing that had made him a field warden, which was to set aside what he felt and look coldly at what he had learned. It takes the command from her, he said slowly. The stand down. It was going to open Rithun, and she gave it a word, and it stood down. He looked at Wren with an interest that was worse somehow than his contempt had been. You control it. It kills on its own initiative, but it stands down on your word. Contractor, do you understand what that is worth? A V-Harkin that obeys is worth a company. A V-Harkin that obeys and still chooses its own targets, that is worth a fleet. I came here to collar an animal. I find I would rather collar the both of you. We're not for sale, Wren said. Everything on this station is for sale, HFY said. That is what a station is. He turned to Vihor, and his cropped crest had gone the smooth, even color of a decision made. Overseer. I'm not going to collar this animal in a medical bay with a hysterical human attached to it and a junior medic quoting handling manuals at me. That is how handlers die. I am going to do it properly. Sedate the subject, deep, full military dose. I'll have my people run it. Your triage clearly can't be trusted with it. And while it's under, we transfer it to the core ship and fit the collar in a controlled cradle. The human's contract you'll terminate tonight and put her on the next supply rotation off station. By the time the animal wakes on my ship, collared in a cradle with no human anywhere on the manifest, it will have nothing to protect and nothing to obey but the collar. They always retrain. It'll grieve a while, then it'll field. You can't sedate him, Wren said. Her voice had gone very flat and very quiet, the voice she used on the worst nights of the burn ward, the voice that meant she had stopped hoping the situation would be reasonable. His floating ribs 4 days into a knit, and his liver analog took a hit on intake that your triage never even worked up. A full military sedation dose on that body could stop his heart. You'd be putting him under to collar him, and he might not come up. Then the problem resolves either way, HFY said, and I've lost a beast I didn't have this morning. Sentiment is not an argument, contractor. Handlers. He raised his hand to signal the sedation prep, the smooth, practiced gesture of a man who had done this 31 times, and Wren stepped forward, putting herself in front of Concord now, reversing them, and Isvit came off the doorway with a cry, and Vihor's crest flushed a panicked color, and for one long-held second the whole bay balanced on the edge of the thing. and the station's proximity klaxon went off. It went off everywhere at once, the deep triple pulse that Wren had only heard in drills, the one that meant unidentified contacts on approach, and the corridor lights snapped to the amber of a security alert, and a voice came over the station channel, tight and disbelieving. All decks, this is operations. We have confirmed the count. We have 11, repeat 11 unidentified biological contacts inbound on the ventral hull. They are not on any transit. They came in dark. They are operations to Field Warden Vaughn. Report to operations, your sir, they're V. Harkin. 11 V. Harkin. They're already on the hull. Ossick Vaughn's hand came down slowly. In the center of the bay, Subject Coron 9 Core lifted his great scarred head, and the low, even rumble that had filled the bay all week, the one the sensors had read as background noise for 4 days and filed and ignored, changed. It rose. It found a new register, one that carried, one that went out through the slate hide and the deck plating and the hull itself, out into the cold dark where 11 shapes clung to the ventral armor of Care Vale Station. And it was not a purr, and it had never been a purr, and every V. Harkin on the hull answered it at once. Wren put her hand on Core's shoulder and felt the sound going through him like a tide, and she understood all at once, everything, the 4 days of patient rumbling, the steadiness of him, the way he had never once seemed afraid, even collared and dying and written off, and she started, helplessly, to laugh. "Oh," she said, "oh, you clever old man, you called them this whole time. You called them home." "Contractor," Vaughn said, and for the first time his voice was not smooth. "What is on my hull?" "His pack," Wren said. She scratched between the leveled quills, and Core leaned his enormous head into her hand, purring now, genuinely purring, the War Alpha who had brought his family across the dark to a station that had written him off. "You wanted to know what he's worth, Field Warden. You're about to find out. And I don't think you're going to like the number." In operations, the deck officer on watch that night was a Sethari named Prell, and he had run the proximity drill 40 times and never once believed he would run the real thing. And he certainly had never believed the real thing would be 11 Class 4 apex predators walking through his station's outer hull like it was a garden gate. They had come in dark. That was the part Prell could not get past in the first minute, while the klaxon hammered and his crest flushed a color he could not control. V. Harkin were fauna. Fauna did not plot a dark approach across contested space, did not time their arrival to the station's own sensor shadow, did not breach an airlock from the outside with the patient competence of a boarding party. But the hull cameras showed 11 of them on the ventral armor, and the ventral service lock, a maintenance airlock, rated for suited crew, tucked behind the water reclamation towers where no camera had a good angle, the ventral service lock was cycling. From the outside, somebody was working the manual override. Something was working the manual override, 3-fingered and hook-thumbed, with the unhurried certainty of a thing that had watched, from a net, from a slab, from a sealed bay, exactly how the 2-legged shapes opened their doors. "They're in the reclamation level," Prell said, into the station channel, and heard his own voice crack. "All decks, the contacts are inside. Repeat, the contacts have breached the ventral service lock and are in water reclamation. Seal blast doors on levels, seal everything below the trauma deck, get personnel above the line. This is not a drill." "Lay that," said Field Warden Vaughn, arriving in operations at a dead run with his handlers behind him, and Prell had never in his life been so relieved to hand a disaster to someone senior. "Do not seal the blast doors. A V. Harkin pack that hits a sealed door does not stop operations. It goes through the wall beside the door, and then you have a hull breach and a pack loose in vacuum-damaged corridors, and you have lost the station. Leave the doors open. A pack that is not cornered moves on a bearing. This pack has a bearing." He was already pulling up the internal schematic, tracing the reclamation level, and his cropped crest had gone the flat working color of a soldier who has stopped being surprised and started being dangerous. "Where is it going? Show me movement." The internal sensors bloomed with contacts, 11 of them moving up out of reclamation into the lower decks, and Prell, watching, felt the second wave of cold because they were not spreading out. A wild pack loose in a station would scatter, would hunt, would follow blood and heat and panic in 11 directions. This pack moved as one body. It flowed up through the lower levels in a tight formation, an arrowhead, and it did not deviate toward the panicking clusters of crew the sensors showed fleeing before it, and it did not stop to hunt, and it climbed level by level on a single unwavering bearing, straight as a dropped plumb line, toward the trauma deck. Toward Bay 4. "It's going to the Alpha," Vaughn said softly. "Of course it is. It's going to Coron 9. And then, because he was a field warden and not a fool, he traced the bearing back down and saw the thing that made his handlers go still. That the packs line up through the station passed directly through the lower mess, through the contract crew quarters, through the densest concentration of small, overlooked people on Care Vale, and that not one of the sensor contacts had slowed or turned or stopped there. 11 War Alphas had moved through the middle of the defenseless lower decks, through corridors packed with fleeing Threnid and Bulk and human contract crew, and had not touched a single one of them. "That's not possible," one of his handlers said. "A pack in a strange hull, adrenalized boarding, they'd have opened everything that moved." "Why aren't they?" "Because the contract crew are hers," Vaughn said, and did not fully understand what he meant when he said it, and would understand it completely within the hour. "Get me eyes on the trauma deck, and someone tell me where the human is." The human was already walking down to meet them. Wren had heard the operations call. Everyone had. It was on every channel, and she had listened to Prell's voice describing 11 contacts climbing the station on a straight bearing for the trauma deck, and she had done the arithmetic that no one in operations could do, because no one in operations had spent a week with their hand on Core's chest listening to the low, even rumble underneath his purr. She knew where the pack was going. She knew it was going to come up through the lower decks where the small people lived, the Threnid and the Bulk, and the 2 other humans on the medical contract, all of them fleeing now, all of them about to have 11 War Alphas come around a corner into a crowded corridor. And she knew, the way she knew the sound of the quills, that if the pack reached that crowded corridor with no one there to tell them the shape of the thing, then it would only take one frightened dockhand with a cargo hook, one panicked security officer with a shock pole, one wrong sudden movement, and the pack would read it as a threat and answer it the way Core answered threats. Except there would be 11 of them and no one to say "Easy, old man," and the lower deck would become the cold room. So Wren got up, and she put her hand on Core's shoulder and she said, "Come on. We're going to go stand in the corridor so nobody does anything stupid." And the War Alpha rose and fell in beside her, and they walked out of Bay 4 together, past the abandoned Hazard Watch, past Isvet who fell in on Wren's other side with her crest white and her jaw set, past Vihor flattened against the wall, and down, toward the sound climbing up to meet them. They met the pack on the landing, where the lower lift shaft opened onto the trauma deck. Wren came around the last turn and stopped, and Core stopped beside her, and coming up the shaft toward them was the pack 11V Harkin, and up close they were not the sensor blips of operations or the hazard fauna renders of the field guide. They were living apex predators filling the shaft wall to wall, scarred and enormous, quills up, eyes catching the amber alert lights. And the corridor behind Wren was full of small people who had run this far and could run no further, and were now pressed against the walls making the small sounds that frightened things make. And for one held breath, the whole thing balanced on the edge of a slaughter. Wren stepped forward in front of Core, in front of all of them, one small unarmed human in a blood-stained smock, and she raised her open empty hands and she said, "Easy." The pack stopped. They stopped the way a wave stops, the front of them checking, the ones behind pressing up and then checking too, 11 War Alphas coming to a halt on a landing, because a soft, short-lived creature with clumsy hands had raised her palms and said a word in a language none of them had ever heard, And then the largest of them, a scarred female half again the size of the others, came up the last of the shaft slow and put her huge head forward and sniffed. Not at Ren. At Core beside her. The female sniffed the healed war alpha long and deep, taking in the whole story of him. The intake wound gone to a clean seam, the crest combed straight, the resin comb marks, the smell of a human's hands worked deep into his hide over 7 days. And then she turned that enormous scarred head and looked at Ren, and Ren looked back, and did not lower her hands, and did not look away, and did not flinch. And the scarred female lowered her head. Slowly, deliberately, the way Core had done it on the first gray dawn, the huge pack matron lowered her head until her brow nearly touched the deck, and behind her, one by one all down the lift shaft, the pack followed her down, 11 war alphas bowing their heads in a strange hulking station corridor to a human they had crossed the cold dark to reach. Because the alpha they had come for stood healed and easy at her side, and his hide told the whole story of the week, and there is no language in the universe, spoken or unspoken, in which that story reads as anything but she kept him alive. "Okay," Ren said, and her voice was not entirely steady now, and she let it not be steady because there was no one here she needed to hide it from. "Okay, hi, come on up. Nobody here's going to hurt you." And she lowered her hands and turned them palm up, and the pack came up onto the trauma deck around her, flowing past her on both sides, huge and warm and reeking of the outside dark, and they did not touch a single one of the small people pressed against the walls, and they gathered around the human and the healed alpha in a loose, warm wall of muscle and quill, and the corridor that had been about to become a slaughter became, instead, the strangest reunion the station had ever seen. Isvit Kaur stood with her back against the wall in the middle of it, 11 war alphas flowing around her because she stood inside the 4-meter circle that Ren's presence made safe, and she watched a contract nurse with no rank and no standing and no authority beyond keeping the floor clean stand in a corridor and turn a boarding action into a homecoming with one open hand and one quiet word, and she thought about the thing her people called strength, the clean cut, the completed function, the reallocation. And she understood, finally and completely and forever, that her people had never once known what strength was. Field Warden Osik Von watched it on the trauma deck feed from operations, and he did not say anything for a long time. His handlers were waiting for orders. Prell was waiting for orders. Vihor had made his way up to operations and was standing at the back with his crest cycling through the whole miserable spectrum of a man, watching his commendation turn into something he could not name, and he was waiting for orders too. And Osik Von, who commanded a fleet and 40-collared V Harkin and had never once been afraid, stood in front of the feed and watched a pack of 11 wild apex predators bow their heads to an unarmed human, and did the sum, and did not like the number, exactly as she had promised him. Because here was the thing Von understood that no one else in operations did. He had 40-collared V Harkin. He had broken them the way you broke a V Harkin, with pain and pressure and the removal of everything they loved until there was nothing left but the collar. And every one of his 40, every single one, in the deepest part of the animal that the collar could not reach, hated him. He knew it. Every field warden knew it. That was the tension you lived with in the Beast Corps, the knowledge that your weapon despised you and obeyed only because you had made obedience the last thing left to it, and that if the collar ever failed, if the signal ever dropped for 1/2 of 1 second, you would have exactly as long to live as it took the animal to remember. And here was a human who had done the opposite thing, who had taken the most dangerous animal Von had ever assessed and gotten from it freely, the one thing he had never once received from any of his 40, not obedience, but the other thing, the thing underneath obedience, the thing his whole broken fleet would have traded their freedom to be able to give. She had gotten its loyalty. And loyalty, Von understood, watching 11 of them arrange themselves around her like a living wall, did not drop when the signal dropped. Loyalty did not have a signal. Loyalty could not be jammed or collared or reallocated. It could only be earned one night by staying, and once earned it did not end, and there was no fleet in the Concord and no weapon in the Corps that could stand against 11 war alphas who had chosen, and Ossip Von had just watched them choose. "Field Warden," Vihor said quietly from the back, "your orders." Von looked at the feed a moment longer. The human was crouched now, down among them, her hand on the scarred matron's jaw, and the War Alpha Cora 9 had put his healed head over her shoulder, and the whole pack had gone loose and easy around her. And even through a monitor, even from 3 decks up, the thing radiated off the image so clearly that Prell's junior officer had to look away. Everyone in that corridor was safe, and it was the most powerful thing Ossip Von had ever seen, and it belonged, entirely and without appeal, to a contract nurse he had come here to put on a supply barge. "My orders," Von said slowly, "are that no one goes near that deck. No poles, no collars, no handlers, nothing." He turned from the feed and his cropped crest had gone a color his handlers had never seen on him. "And someone get me everything on file about the human. Everything. Because I came here thinking I understood what an apex predator was, and I have just been corrected, and I would like to know exactly who did the correcting before I decide what to do about it." Overseer Talmik Vihor did not sleep that night, and by the gray of the station's false dawn he had arrived, through the cold logic that had carried him up 40 cycles of the Concord ladder, at the only conclusion that let him keep his standing. The human had to go. Not the animals were beyond him now, 11 of them, a problem for the Beast Corps or for the Concord Defense Fleet, above his pay and outside his authority. But the human was still his. She was contract medical staff. She fell under the surgical service under him, and she was the axis the whole impossible thing turned on. Von had said it in operations before he'd gone quiet. The pack orients on the human. Remove the resource, the protection has nothing to defend. Von had said that about Corps on the first day and been wrong because he had not understood yet what he was looking at. But Vihor thought Von had been wrong about the wrong thing. The pack did orient on the human. Everything oriented on the human. She was the center of it, and if she were simply removed, quietly, cleanly, before Von's caution hardened into policy, then the animals would have no center and would leave, or could be managed, or would at least stop being Talmik Vihor's catastrophe. He did not intend to harm her. He told himself this, and it was even mostly true. He intended to detain her. He had the authority. A contract nurse who had committed 3 handling violations and induced a Class 4 breach of the station perimeter could be placed in protective confinement pending Concord review, and no one would question the paperwork. And once she was in the brig on the security deck, 3 sealed blast doors away from the pack, then the animals would settle, and Von would thank him, and the station would remember that Overseer Vihor had contained the crisis that the contractor had caused. He went to Osgun, the security officer the V. Harkin had swept off its feet, because Osgun had a grievance and grievances made men useful. He gave Osgun 2 others and a set of restraints and an order that was clean and quiet and legal on its face. Locate the contractor Halloran, detain her under station discipline, and escort her to security confinement. Do it at the shift change when the trauma deck was thinnest. Do it fast. Do not, under any circumstances, engage the animals. Simply take the human when she was clear of them, which she would have to be eventually, because even she had to sleep, even she had to eat, even she could not stand in a corridor forever with her hand on a beast. It was, Vihor thought, a good plan. It was clean. It was legal. It failed to account for exactly one thing, which was the thing his entire species had spent its whole history failing to account for, and which he would understand at last on the floor of his own trauma deck with a War Alpha's breath on his face. That the pack did not orient on the human because she was its center. The pack oriented on the human because she was its member, and you do not detain a pack's member 3 sealed doors away and expect the pack to settle. You give it a heading. They took her at the shift change, exactly as Vihor had planned, and for about 4 seconds it went exactly as Vihor had planned. Ren had stepped away from the pack, the first time in a day she'd been more than arm's reach from Kor, because a bulk dockhand 3 corridors over had gone into cardiac distress, and his crew had come running for the hand that stayed, and Ren had done what she always did, which was go at once without thinking about her own cover, because a man was dying and that was the job. Isfit had gone with her. Kor had risen to follow, and Ren had put her hand flat on his chest and said, "Stay. Watch them. I'll be right back." And the War Alpha, who obeyed exactly one creature in the universe, had stayed because she had asked, and had settled back among his pack to watch the small people, the way she'd taught him to watch the small people, and had let her go. So she was in the side corridor, 3 turns from the pack, on her knees over a bulk dockhand with her hands buried in the work of keeping his heart going, when Osgun and his 2 came around the corner with the restraints. "Contractor Halloran, station discipline, you're to come with us." "He's arresting," Ren said, not looking up. "Give me 2 minutes, I've got a pulse coming back." "Now," Osgun said, and reached down and took her arm and pulled her up off the dying dockhand, and Ren, who had spent a week being calm, being steady, being the still hand on the War Alpha's chest, lost her footing on the wet deck and went down hard against the corridor wall, and her head cracked against the plating, and a thin line of red opened above her ear and ran down into her collar. It was not much. She would say so afterward over and over to a station that had stopped listening to that particular protest. It was a slip and a knock, a shove that got away from a nervous man, a cut that needed a strip of seal and nothing more. Ren Halloran had taken worse falls carrying laundry. It was, by any honest measure, almost nothing. But 3 corridors away, in the loose, warm gathering of the pack, Kor smelled her blood on the recycled air. Isfit was the only Sethari who saw the whole of it, and she described it later at the Concord inquiry, in a voice that did not shake because she had decided it would not. The Alpha came up off the deck before the rest of them. He did not roar. That is the thing I need the panel to understand. There was no display, no warning, no sound at all. He had spent a week learning that sound was how he told the human a threat was managed. When the threat was not managed, he did not make the sound. He simply moved. And the pack moved with him, all 11 in the same instant on the same bearing, because they had all caught it at once, the blood of the one who kept the Alpha alive, spilled by a Sethari hand, and there is no collar, no wall, no order, and I think now no force in the Concord that stops that. I watched it leave the corridor. It was the most disciplined and the most terrifying thing I have ever seen. They did not touch one small person on the way. They went through the station like water finding the one crack, straight to the smell of her blood, and they arrived in under 9 seconds, and the overseer's men were still holding her arm. Osgun heard them coming. Everyone on the trauma deck heard them coming, not a sound from the animals, but the sound the station made around them, the crew scrambling, the crash of a cart, the rising human and Threnid and bulk voices all crying the same warning down the corridors ahead of the thing they could not see yet but could feel arriving. Osgun let go of Ren's arm. His 2 companions were already running. And Osgun, to his small and only credit, understood in his last clear second that running was not a plan that worked on a V-Harkin, and he turned to face the corridor mouth with his shock pole coming up, and Kor came around the turn low and fast and enormous, quills leveled, amber eye gone to something with no bottom and no fire banked in it now, all of it out, and Osgun's shock pole never landed. Ren, on the floor, her ears ringing, blood in her collar, saw the War Alpha fill the corridor and saw exactly what was about to happen, and did the only thing she had ever known how to do. KORR, not a scream. A command, the flat, hard, absolute voice of a charge nurse on the worst night of the ward, the voice that stops a room. Stop. And the impossible thing, the thing that would be argued over in Concord defense briefings for years, the thing that broke Ossip Vaughn's understanding of his own trade in half. The War Alpha stopped. He stopped over Osgun with his leveled crest a hand's breadth from the security officer's throat. 1,100 kilos of vengeance halted mid-stride by a single word from a human sitting bleeding on the floor. And behind him the whole pack stopped, the entire arrowhead of them. 11 war alphas frozen in a station corridor, because the one they had come to avenge had told them no. Kor held there, shaking. Ren could see him shaking, could see the war of it in him, the deepest instinct he owned pulling him toward the throat of the creature that had spilled her blood, and the one thing he had chosen to love holding him back with a word. He held. His breath sawed over Osgun's face. And Osgun, who had lost a cousin to a V-Harkin raid and had opinions about the natural order, looked up into the amber ruin of that eye and lost, all at once and permanently, every opinion he had ever held. "Don't," Ren said, quieter now, getting to her knees, one hand pressed to the cut above her ear. "Don't, old man, look at me, not him. I'm okay. I'm right here, it's a scrape. I've had worse making beds. Look at me." And Kor's amber eye came off Osgun's throat and found her, and the shaking went through him one more time and then bled out degree by degree, the way it always did, because she had told him the threat was managed and the war alpha chose, even now, even with her blood in the air, to believe her. He lifted his head off the security officer. He turned and crossed the corridor and put his enormous scarred brow against her chest, hard, insistent, breathing her in, checking her the way she had checked him for a week, and Ren wrapped both arms around that huge, grieving head and pressed her face into the comb-straight quills and said, I know, I'm okay, I'm okay. You came, good boy. I'm okay." The pack closed around them. 11 war alphas making a wall, and past the wall, backed against the corridor plating. Still holding a shock pole he had not lived quite long enough to be glad he hadn't swung. Osgun slid down the wall to the floor and did not get up, and would not be the one in the end, whose career this cost. That would be the one who had given the order. Because Vihor had come to watch. That was the mistake that finished him. Not the order might have been survivable. Orders got lost in the noise of an inquiry all the time. It was that Talmuk Vihor, who had spent 40 cycles never quite believing that the world would refuse to obey him, had come down to the trauma deck to see his clean, quiet plan resolve his catastrophe. And so he was standing in the mouth of the cross corridor, in his surgical graze, with his crest flushed the eager bronze of a man expecting to be made whole, when the pack arrived, and when the whole thing turned, and the war alpha stopped on the human's word. And the danger folded itself back down into a wall of muscle around a bleeding nurse. There was a lull, a held breath. And in the lull, the scarred pack matron, the huge female who had led them up out of the dark, lifted her head from the wall of the pack, and turned it slow, and looked across the corridor at the one Sethari standing there in clean grays who smelled of the order. They could smell it. That was the thing Vaughn wrote in his report afterward, the thing that changed how the Concord handled the Beast Corps forever. They can smell the origin of a thing, not just the hand that spilled the blood, the will behind the hand. Osgun had taken the arm, but Osgun had been given the arm to take, and the pack knew the difference, the way a soldier knows the difference between the blade and the hand that drew it, and the matron looked across the corridor at Talmuk Vihor, and she knew him for what he was, and she came. She did not run, she walked. She walked across the corridor slow and enormous, quills up, and Vihor's eager bronze crashed to the sick gray-white of the first morning and further, to a color that had no name, and he backed into the plating and had nowhere to go, and the matron put her huge scarred head forward until her leveled quills brushed the front of his graze, and she breathed him in, long and deep, taking the whole measure of the man who had signed a write-off and sold a healed patient to a collar, and given the order that had put blood in the air, and she opened her mouth. Enough, Ren said. She said it tired and quiet, and it carried the whole length of the corridor, and the matron stopped with her jaws open around the ruin of Talmuk Vihor's career, and did not close them. Ren got to her feet, one hand still on Core's brow, blood drying in her collar, and she looked across the corridor at the overseer pinned, and shaking against the wall he had backed into, at the man who had told her on the first night that the animal was beneath the station's grief, and she was there to keep the floor clean, and she was too tired to hate him, and that, Isvet would say later, was the thing that finished Vihor more completely than any set of jaws could have. "Let him go," Ren said to the matron. "He's not worth what you'd pay for him." And then, to Vihor in the flat, even voice, with a War Alpha's pack arranged at her back and her blood on her collar and no rank and no standing and no authority beyond keeping the floor clean, "You should go, overseer. And you should send the medic corps down here with a suture kit, because you knocked me into a wall and somebody competent should close it. That's the job I'd give you. Fetching the kit. It's about the level you've earned on my floor." The matron drew her huge head back, slow, and turned, and the jaws that had been open around Talmec Vihor's throat closed instead on empty corridor air with a sound like a blast door seating home, and she walked back to the pack and left him standing. She left him standing, unmarked, untouched, and utterly finished, in front of his own residence and his own security, and the whole lower deck that had come up the shafts to see, left him with his life and nothing else, which was, Ren had understood without ever being told, so much worse than the alternative, because a man the pack had killed would have been a tragedy, and a man the pack had judged not worth the killing and turned its back on was only, forever, a man the beasts had found beneath their grief. He went, there was nothing else for him to do. He went down the corridor past the small people who did not make way for him, and he did not come back to the trauma deck, and within the week, he would request transfer off Cairvale to a posting no one envied, and the surgical service would let him go without a farewell, and the story of how Overseer Talmec Vihor had been weighed by a war beast, and found not worth the bite would follow him the rest of his cold, competent career. And on the trauma deck, Isvet Kor came running with a suture kit, exactly as instructed, and knelt down beside the human in the middle of the pack, and closed the cut above her ear with 4 small careful stitches, and neither of them said anything for a while, because there was nothing that needed saying, and around them the War Alphas settled, one by one, into a loose, warm ring, and Kor put his healed head in Ren's lap. And the purr came up through the deck like something the station had been missing for a very long time, and had only now, at last, brought home. Field Warden Ossik Von came to see her alone, on the 5th day, which the human calendar the contract crew kept called Friday. He came without handlers, without collars, without the collar cache unclipped from his thigh. Isvet noted all of it, from her spot in the corner of the repurposed bay, and understood that each absence was a sentence in a language the field warden did not have the humility to speak aloud. He stopped in the wide iris of what had been Bay 4, and was now something the station did not have a word for, a clinic with an apex predator pack folded around it, and he looked at the human sitting on an overturned supply crate with the healed War Alpha's head in her lap, and a scarred pack matron dozing against her hip, and a threned child, brought up by its terrified parent for a fever that no Sethari triage would clear, asleep against the matron's flank, and Ossik Von, who had broken 31 V Harkin and never once been afraid, took a long time to speak. "May I sit?" he said finally. Ren looked at him. There were 4 small stitches above her ear and a fading bruise under them, and she was, Von could see, exhausted in the specific way of a person who has not been off her feet in 5 days. But her eyes, when they came up to his, were steady, and unafraid and mildly, tiredly curious, the way you'd look at a weather front you couldn't do anything about. "There's a crate," she said, and nodded at one. "Kor won't like it, he doesn't like the harness, but he'll let you if I tell him to." "Then tell him to," Von said, and sat, and the War Alpha lifted his head from the human's lap and leveled his crest at the field warden and gave the dry blade-on-stone hiss, and Ren put her hand flat on Kor's chest and said, "He's fine. He's just here to talk." Easy, and the crest came down, slow, and Kor settled back with his amber eye fixed on Vaughn and his attention up. And Vaughn understood that he was being permitted, on sufferance, in a space that belonged completely to the human, and that the permission could be revoked with a word he could not himself speak. "I have spent the night reading your file," Vaughn said. "Ren Halloran, 26 standard cycles. 2 years on a burn ward on your homeworld. I had to look up what that is. A ward for the ones who have been burned, the ones who mostly do not survive and who suffer greatly in the time before they do not. You worked there 2 years by choice, at the bottom of your profession's pay and status, and then you signed a Concord medical contract and came out to the edge of the dark to keep the floor clean on a station that regards your species as a short-lived resource of convenient dexterity." He paused. "I could not, at first, understand why a person would choose the burn ward. My people do not have burn wards. A soldier burned beyond return is reallocated. I told your medic once. I have been told your medic has quoted me on it, the clean cut. That is what strength is to us." "Isfit told me," Ren said. "I have been thinking about the clean cut for 5 days," Vaughn said. "Since I stood in operations and watched 11 Class 4 apex predators bow their heads to you in a corridor. I command 40 V Harkin Halloran. I broke every one of them myself, and every one of them in the place the collar cannot reach, hates me, and would kill me the instant the signal dropped, and I have known this and lived with it for 40 cycles and called it the price of the weapon. I came here to add a 41st. And instead I have watched a creature who will not obey any collar ever made obey you, a soft, unarmed, unranked human with a scrape on her head, obey you across the full width of its deepest instinct, stop with its jaws at a throat because you said its name. And I need to understand it, and I do not, and it is unmaking something in me that I built my whole life on. So I am going to ask you plainly, contractor, and I would ask you to answer me plainly. How did you do it? What did you do that I have never once, in 40 cycles and 40 beasts, managed to do?" Ren was quiet for a moment. Her hand moved slow through the combed quills of the War Alpha in her lap. "You want the honest answer, or the one that sounds good?" "The honest one." "I stayed," Ren said. "That's it. That's the whole thing. You keep looking for the technique, field warden, and there isn't one. Your whole trade is built on the idea that a V Harkin is a weapon, and the only question is how you make it fire. And I didn't make Kor anything. He was dying, and everybody in this building had agreed to let him. And I couldn't do that, so I stayed with him all night. And I cleared his airway, and I gave him water off my hand, and I told him he wasn't going to die under a number. And in the morning he put his head against my hand." She looked up at Vaughn. "You broke your 40 by taking away everything they loved until there was nothing left but you. I did the opposite thing. I gave him one thing to love back. That's not a technique. You can't collar it and you can't teach it in your core, and I think that's what's unmaking you, because it means the whole thing you built your life on had the answer backward. You don't get the loyalty by breaking the beast. You get it by being the one who stayed when the beast was breaking." Ossik Vaughn sat with that for a long time. The threned child snored against the matron's flank. Kor's purr went in the floor. "There is a raid on this frontier every 40 days or so," Vaughn said at last, quietly. "Ones who take the V Harkin, the ones I fight for the beasts, they will come again. They always come again. When they do, my 40 collared weapons will fight because the collar makes them, and some of them will fail at the worst moment because a broken thing always fails at the worst moment, and Sethari soldiers will die in the gap. And I have sat here all night doing a sum I do not like, Halloran, the same sum I did in operations, and it comes out the same every time. Your 11 would not fail. Your 11 would not need a collar or a signal or a field warden. Your 11 would fight for the thing they chose, which does not drop and cannot be jammed, and there is no weapon in my core worth a tenth of that." He looked at her. "So I am going to ask you the thing I came to ask. Not to collar them. I understand now that the collar is the disease, not the cure. I am asking you to bring them into the core as what they are, free, loyal, yours, and to teach my people how a creature comes to choose. Because if humans can do this, if this is a thing your soft, short-lived species simply knows how to do, then everything my people believe about strength is a child's mistake, and I am too old to keep making it. No collars, Ren said. Ever. Not on core, not on the pack, not on any V-harken your core takes from here on. That's the price. You don't break another one. No collars, Vaughn said, and reached down and unclipped the collar cache from his thigh and set it on the deck between them. The row of dormant war collars folded small and waiting, 40 cycles of his trade laid down on a clinic floor. You have my word as a field warden, and I would ask you to witness medic corps, because a human's word and a Sethari's are both only as good as who heard them given. I witness it, Isvit said, from the corner, her crest cycling slow through the color she only ever showed in the bay. Kor lifted his head out of Ren's lap and looked at the collar cache on the deck, and then at the field warden, and then he did a thing that Vaughn would put in his report, and that the Concord would eventually carve, in 4 blunt words, over the door of a place that did not yet exist. He reached out with one 3-fingered hand, slow, deliberate, and he closed it around the collar cache, and he crushed it, unhurried, exactly as much force as the job required and not 1 unit more, and he dropped the ruined thing back on the deck, and put his head back in the human's lap, and resumed his purr. I believe, Ossik Vaughn said, after a moment, in the voice of a man watching the foundation of his life quietly rearrange itself into something better, that the subject concurs. The name that the lower decks had made, the hand that stayed, came up onto the surgical floor that same week, and no one could stop it, because it had stopped being a story and become a fact you could see with your own eyes. It was the small people who brought it up, the way they brought everything up, mouth to mouth, from below. But it was the pack that made it into doctrine, and the pack made it into doctrine in the way of the whole niche, which is to say by taking the softest, most domestic, most unremarkable thing the human did, and treating it with the gravity of a battle order. It began with the water. Ren still gave Kor water off her hand. She did not have to anymore. He was healed. He could drink from a trough like any beast. But she did it anyway in the quiet part of the night, the folded sponge soaked and pressed to the corner of his mouth, drop and trickle, because it was the thing they had done on the first night, and some things you keep because keeping them is the point. And the pack watched her do it. And one night the scarred matron rose, and went to where a wounded bulk dockhand lay on a pallet in the crowded bay, feverish and unable to lift his own head to the cup beside him. And the matron took the cup, clumsy in the hooks of one huge hand, and she pressed it to the dockhand's mouth, and tipped it, slow, drop and trickle, exactly as she had watched the human do, and gave the small, terrified, sweating dockhand water off the cup until he could drink on his own. Isvit saw it and could not speak. The dockhand's crewmates saw it and told the lower mess, and the lower mess understood it the way the lower mess understood everything, immediately and completely. And by the next meal, the 4 blunt words the threned orderly had first said now had a second meaning, an active one, a thing you did and not just a thing that had been done to you. The hand that stayed. It meant the human who did not leave. And now it meant also the thing you became when you had been kept alive by someone who stayed, the thing the pack had become, the thing the matron did with the cup, the thing 11 war alphas did every night in a crowded clinic bay, holding the door and warming the drapes and tipping water into the mouths of the small hurt people nobody else would treat. Stay with them, the doctrine said. In 4 words a threned orderly had found in a lower mess, and a war alpha had made real. Be the one who stayed. It was the first article of a code that had no author and belonged to no species, coined by the smallest people on the station, and enforced by the largest predators in Concord space. And within the year, it would be carved over the door of the place they built around Ren Halloran. And within 5 years, there would be a class of medics across the whole frontier who took it as their oath. And none of them, not one, would ever again let a patient die under a number. But that was later. On the 5th day, on the day the contract crew called Friday, it was still just a thing the pack did in the night, a war beast tipping a cup, and a human asleep at last on an overturned crate with a scarred head in her lap, and a field warden sitting on the floor of a clinic learning, 40 cycles late, what strength had been the whole time. It was not only the water they copied. Once the pack had a habit to hold, it held all of them, the way soldiers hold a drill, and the human's smallest routines became, one by one, articles of a code no one had written down. Wren checked her patients on a round, the same loop every few hours, palate to palate, a hand on each brow, a word to each waking one. And within 2 days the pack walked the round with her, not crowding, not underfoot, but ranged behind her in a loose-moving wedge. The matron at her left and Core at her right, and the 9 others fanned back in a formation that a Sethari drill instructor would have recognized and could not have taught. 11 war alphas pacing a clinic round at a human's shoulder because she had done it, and so it was the thing that was done. When she crouched at a pallet, the wedge settled. When she rose, it rose. When she moved to the next, it flowed with her, and the sick people in the pallets, who a week ago would have died of fright to see 1V hearken, learned to wait for the round the way children wait for a familiar step in the hall, because the round meant the hand that stayed was coming, and behind her came the wall that kept the taking ones out. Vaughn watched a full round from the doorway one night and did not say anything for a long time, and then he said, to no one, in the voice of a man doing a sum he had spent 40 cycles refusing to do, I drilled formation into my 40 for a year each. Whistle and shock, until they ranked on command. And they ranked because failing to rank was pain. He nodded at the wedge flowing behind the human, settling as she settled, rising as she rose. Nobody drilled that. There is no whistle. There is no shock. She walks and they follow because they would rather be behind her than anywhere else in Concord space. I spent a year in a collar getting a worse version of a thing she got by accident by being someone worth ranking behind. He was quiet. I'm going to have to unlearn everything, Core, at my age. All of it. Yes, Isfit said, not unkindly. I have found it is worth the trouble. There was a name for that too, before the week was out, though it began as a joke and hardened into doctrine the way the best of them do. A bulk dockhand, watching the round flow past his pallet, half delirious with fever, was heard to murmur that the beasts walked like they were reading her like scripture, following the gospel one pallet at a time, and the medics who trained under the carved words would, within the year, call the clinic round exactly that, without irony, with the flat gravity of martial people who have found something sacred and made it a procedure. The following word. It meant the round the pack walked at the healer's shoulder. It meant more than that. The thing a creature does when it has decided that where you go is where it goes, that your work is its work, that it will rank behind you not because it must but because you were the one who stayed. There were beasts on the frontier, a generation later, who had never seen Care Vale and never met a human, walking clinic rounds at the shoulders of medics who had never met Wren Halloran, keeping the following word, and none of them knew that it had started with one nurse doing her pallet loop in a reclassified bay, followed by a war beast who had only just worked out what a room was for. The station had one more thing to learn that day. It would learn it the hard way, the way stations on the edge of the dark always learn things, and it would learn it because the raid came early. The raiders were called the Gorn, and they were the reason the Beast Corps existed, and they hit Care Vale 11 days ahead of the frontier's grim little schedule because they had learned, the way predators learn, that the station's attention was turned inward on a strangeness in its trauma deck. Vaughn was in operations when it broke, which was the only piece of luck the day allowed, because Vaughn understood at once what the watch officer Prell did not. The contacts did not come in dark this time. They came in loud, a raider frigate dropping out of transit right on top of the station's blind ventral quarter, its boarding tubes already extending, its intent so naked that Prell wasted 3 full seconds simply disbelieving it. The Gorn did not negotiate and did not demand and did not warn. They took. They took ships and stations and the living cargo inside them, and above all, on this frontier, they took V. Harkin, Because a Gorn war host that fielded a broken V Harkin was worth twice a war host that did not. And the only thing better than a broken V Harkin was 11 of them, healed and gathered conveniently in one place, which was a thing the Gorn frigate's captain had learned from the same rumor tide that had carried the hand that stayed across the frontier. Boarding tubes on the ventral quarter, 3 of them there through the armor, Prell said, and his voice cracked and then steadied, because Vaughn was standing beside him and a soldier steadies beside a soldier. Field Warden, they're not going for the reactor or the bridge, they're going lateral, they're going for the trauma deck, Vaughn said. They're going for the pack. And he was already moving, already on the core channel, already giving the order he had given 100 times. All core units, boarders on the ventral quarter, engage and repel. Priority is the trauma deck move. And his 40-collared V Harkin, on his own ship docked at the station's spine, woke to the collar command and rose to fight, and 11 of them in the first 60 seconds failed. They did not fail from cowardice. Vaughn knew that even as the core channel filled with the stammering reports, units unresponsive, units seizing, units turning on the handlers. They failed the way a broken thing always fails at the worst moment, because the Gorn knew V Harkin too, knew them better than the Concord liked to admit, and the Gorn frigate was flooding the core ship's channels with the countersignal, the jamming pulse the raiders had spent a generation perfecting. And where the countersignal touched a collar, the collar dropped, and where the collar dropped, the V Harkin remembered, all at once, 40 cycles of who had put the collar on. And a broken beast with a dropped collar and a lifetime of hate does not become an ally. It becomes a third army. Vaughn's own weapons turned in his hands, exactly as he had always known in the deepest place that they someday would, and the core ship became a slaughterhouse, and the boarders came on toward the trauma deck through a station whose great weapon had just, at the worst possible moment, eaten itself. They're through to the trauma level, Prell said, hollow. Field Warden, the core is we don't have the core. Whatever they jammed, it's the collars are down and the beasts are loose on your ship and we don't have the core. There's nothing between the boarders and the trauma deck. There's nothing between them and there's nothing there but the contractor. There's nothing there but her and the sick and the 11. Ossip Vaughn looked at the schematic, at the Gorn boarding line converging on the trauma deck, at his 40 broken weapons scattered and turned, and he did the last sum of the day, and this one, for the first time all week, he liked. No, he said quietly, there's everything there. Operations, do not send security to the trauma deck. Do not send anyone. Anyone we send with a weapon, the pack reads as a second threat and we lose them in the crossfire. Seal the decks above and below and get every camera you have on the trauma level and put it on every screen on the station. He straightened, and his cropped crest had gone the flat working color, the dangerous one, but under it was something Prell had never seen on a field warden's face, something that looked almost like hope. Because the whole Concord has spent a generation believing that the way you make a V Harkin fight for you is to break it. And in about 90 seconds, every soul on Cairvale is going to watch what happens when you don't. Wren woke because Core moved. She had fallen asleep at last on the overturned crate, hours deep, the first real sleep in 5 days, and she came up out of it all at once because the War Alpha came up out of the human's lap all at once, and the whole pack was already on its feet, and the bay was full of a sound she had never heard from them. Not the leveled crest hiss they gave a shock pole, not the bottomless snarl of the first morning, but a low unified thunder, 11 chests at once. A sound with a direction and a hunger in it, aimed down corridor at something climbing toward them through the station. What is it? Wren said, on her feet now, one hand on Core's shoulder, and Isvit was already at the bay's comm panel with her crest gone white, listening to the station channel, and she turned with a face Wren had learned to read. Orders, Isvit said. The Gorn, the ones who take the V Harkin. They've broken into the station and the core has failed. Vaughn's beasts are jammed, they're loose, they've turned, and the boarders are coming here. For the pack. For she looked at the bay full of sick and wounded small people, the bulk dockhand, the feverish threned child, the two other humans on the medical contract who had come to help and now had nowhere to run for all of it. And there's no security coming, Ren. Vaughn's holding them back. He said not to send anyone with a weapon. He said the pack would handle it. He put it on every screen on the station. He's making everyone watch. Ren looked at the bay. 20-some wounded and sick, the ones nobody else would treat, packed into a repurposed isolation ward at the dead end of a corridor with a Gorn boarding party climbing toward them and no one coming to help. She looked at the 11 War Alphas on their feet with the aimed thunder rolling in their chests. She looked at Core. She did not have a plan. That was the thing she would tell the Concord inquiry later, when they wanted the technique, when they wanted the doctrine, when they wanted to write down exactly how one unarmed human nurse had held the trauma deck of Care Vale against a Gorn boarding host. She did not have a plan, and she did not have a weapon, and she did not have any authority beyond keeping the floor clean. What she had was a floor full of patients and a pack that had chosen her, and she did the only thing she had ever known how to do, which was to stand between the hurt people and the thing that was coming, and to trust the ones who had stayed. "Okay," Ren said, and her voice was the flat, even one, the charge nurse one, the one that stops a room. "Okay, Core, listen to me." The War Alpha's amber eye came to her, all his attention, the whole vast lethal weight of him oriented on one small human. "The ones coming down that corridor are not the small people. You understand, they're not the sick ones. They're the ones who take. They're the net and the collar and the ones who shot you." She could see him take it, could see the amber eye change, the banked fire come up. "Everybody in this room is mine. Everybody behind me is mine. And the ones coming are not. So you keep them off my floor. You hear me? Keep them off my floor. Go." Core went. The pack went with him. 11 War Alphas pouring out of the bay and into the dead-end corridor in a single black flood. And Ren came to the bay door and stood in it with her arms out to hold the frightened patients back. And Isfit came and stood at her shoulder. And the two humans on the medical contract came and stood at her other shoulder. And the small people who could stand got up off their pallets and came and stood behind her. The threned and the bulk and the reallocated and the written off. And they made a wall of themselves at the door of the clinic, unarmed, behind an unarmed nurse, and in front of the wall the pack met the Gorn. Ren did not watch most of it. She turned inward to her patients, to the ones on the pallets who could not stand, and she kept them calm the way she kept everything calm, with her hands and her low, even voice, while behind her in the corridor the War Alphas did the work they had crossed the cold dark to be allowed to do. She heard it more than saw it, and what she heard was not a slaughter, not chaos, not the loose-feeding frenzy the Gorn had counted on when they'd come to take 11 leaderless jammed beasts. What she heard was a pack that fought like Core had swept Oskan off his feet, with exactly as much force as the job required and a terrible unified discipline. The boarders' weapons crashing, and then falling silent, the Gorn war cries turning to something else, the slap and thunder of 11 bodies moving as one down a corridor with a single unwavering purpose, keeping the taking ones off the human's floor. The Gorn had jamming pulses for collars. They had counter-signals for the Core. They had a generation of hard-won knowledge about how to unmake a broken V-Harkin at the worst moment. And they had nothing at all for a pack that fought free, because there was no signal to jam on a loyalty that had no signal, no collar to drop on a choice that could not be dropped, no way in their whole cruel science to reach 11 War Alphas who were not fighting because they had been made to, but because a soft, short-lived human had stayed with their alpha in the dark, and had told them an hour ago that the hurt people at her back were hers. You cannot break a thing that was never made. You cannot turn a thing that chose. The Gorn learned it in a dead-end corridor on Care Vale, in front of every screen on the station, and it cost them their whole boarding host to learn it, and the survivors who broke and fled back down their boarding tubes carried the lesson home to the frontier. Do not go where the free ones are. Do not go where she is. It was over in 4 minutes. Wren felt it in the way she'd felt everything with the pack, through the floor, through the change in the sound, the thunder winding down, the corridor going quiet, and then the click and scrape of huge claws on deck plating coming back. Cor came into the bay first. He was breathing hard, and there was Gorn blood on him that was not his and a fresh score across his shoulder that was, and he crossed the bay straight to Wren and put his enormous scarred head against her chest, hard, checking her, breathing her in, and Wren wrapped her arms around it and pressed her face into the quills and said, I know, you kept them off my floor. Good boy, good boy. Let me see that shoulder. And behind him, the pack flowed back into the bay, all 11, scored and winded and alive, and arranged themselves in a loose, warm ring around the human and the wounded, and the small people at the door let out a breath the whole frontier had been holding for a generation, and somewhere 3 decks up in operations, on every screen on the station, the image held. A nurse with her arms around a war beast's head in a room full of the people nobody else would save, ringed by the free pack that had just done what the entire collared corps could not. Field Warden Ossip von watched it end from operations, and when it was over he stood for a while in front of the dark screen, and then he took off his field harness, the gray one with the empty collar cache mount, the uniform of 40 cycles of a trade he now understood had been wrong from its first day, and he folded it, and he set it down, and he went down to the trauma deck to begin, at 50-some cycles old, to learn how to be the kind of soldier a beast would choose. He found the human closing the score on the War Alpha's shoulder with a strip of seal, the same unhurried competence she'd have given a dockhand's crushed fingers, talking to the animal low the whole time. He found the pack settling. He found the small people already moving among the wounded, tipping cups, warming drapes, doing the thing the doctrine had a name for now, the thing they had all learned from watching her. The core is gone, Von said. My 40. What the Gorn didn't turn, I'll have to, there's no returning them. I broke them and the Gorn dropped their collars and they remembered, and there's no coming back from what they remembered. The whole beast core, 40 cycles of it, ended in an hour because it was built wrong from the start. He looked at the free pack, at the ring of them, at the War Alpha letting a human seal a wound on his shoulder without a collar or a wand or a single unit of force. And you held the station with 11, you never collared at all. So I'm going to ask the Concord to let me build it again, Halloran, from nothing, from your one article, and I'd like you to run it, because I've been a field warden for 40 cycles, and I've learned in 5 days that I don't know the first thing about the only weapon that ever mattered, and you do. Wren finished the seal on Cor's shoulder and smoothed it down and gave the War Alpha a scratch between the quills, and Cor leaned his healed head into her hand and started, despite everything, despite the blood and the score and the 4 minutes in the corridor, to purr. I'm not a field warden, Wren said. I'm a nurse. Yes, Von said. That is precisely the qualification. The Concord sent an inquiry, because the Concord sent an inquiry after everything, and the inquiry wanted, above all things, a technique. They convened it on Cairvale 11 days after the raid, 3 commissioners down from the core worlds, and they set up in the station's largest briefing room and they called witnesses. And what they wanted, Isfit understood it within the first hour, watching them, and it made her tired in a way she had not expected, was a procedure. A repeatable method. A thing they could write into a manual and issue to the core and reproduce across the frontier without ever having to feel the thing that produced it. They had watched the trauma deck feed. They had seen 11 free V-Harkin do what 40 collared ones could not, and they had concluded, in the way of commissioners, that the human possessed a technique, and they had come to extract it. They called Field Warden Von first, and Von told them there was no technique, and they wrote down that the Field Warden was declining to disclose his methods. They called Isfit Core, and Isfit told them the whole of it, the write-off, the night, the airway, the water off the hand. The head lowered on the first gray dawn and told them there was no technique, only a person who stayed, and they wrote down that the junior medic's account was emotionally compromised by proximity to the subject. They were building, the three of them, toward the conclusion they had brought with them, which was that the human had a method she would not share, and that the method, once obtained, could be issued to properly qualified Sethari handlers, and the awkward business of the contractor could then be closed. Then they called Wren, and Wren sat down in front of them with Core's head in her lap. They had tried to bar the animal from the briefing room and had been informed by the animal that this was not a thing that was going to happen, and had elected not to press it. And the senior commissioner, a pale, narrow Sethari named Oral Sesh with the smooth crest of the core worlds, asked her to describe her methodology for establishing handler response in a Class 4 Apex subject. I don't have one, Wren said. Contractor, 11 Class 4 subjects repelled a Gorn boarding host under your direction. That is not an accident. There is a methodology. The Concord requires it. There's no methodology, Wren said. You keep using that word like it's a machine you can take apart. It's not a machine. I'll tell you exactly what I did and you're not going to like it because it can't be issued to a handler and it can't be written in a manual and it doesn't scale. She looked at the three of them, tired, steady, unafraid. He was dying and everyone had agreed to let him, and I stayed. That's the whole thing. I stayed with him all night and I kept him alive, and I didn't make him do anything and I didn't break anything and I didn't use a collar or a wand or a technique. I just refused to let a living thing die alone under a number. And in the morning he chose me. You cannot issue that to a handler, Commissioner. A handler who stays with a dying beast in order to obtain a weapon is not staying. The animal knows the difference. That's the whole secret, and it's not a secret, and it's why your core failed and my pack didn't. You can't fake the staying. It only works if you'd have done it anyway. If you'd have done it even if the beast had died in the night and you'd got nothing at all. The senior commissioner was quiet for a moment. His crest, Isvit noticed, had gone very still. You are describing, Oral Sesh said slowly, a method that only functions when performed by someone who is not attempting the method. Yes, Wren said. That cannot be operationalized. No, Wren agreed. It can't. That's what I keep telling you. You want a lever and I'm telling you it's not a lever, it's a person. You don't need a technique, Commissioner. You need people who'd stay. You've got a whole species that calls staying a weakness and calls the clean cut strength, and you built a core on the clean cut, and it ate itself in an hour the first time it was tested. So maybe the thing to write in your manual isn't my methodology. Maybe it's that you had the whole thing backward, and the strongest force any of you have ever seen came from the one value your people decided was beneath you. That's not a technique. That's a mirror. And I understand why you'd rather have the technique. The briefing room was silent. Core's purr went in the floor. The inquiry did not get its technique. It got instead, after a great deal of argument the small people never heard and the pack did not care about, a decision, because the Concord, whatever else it was not entirely a fool, and 3 commissioners who had watched a nurse hold a station with a pack she never collared were capable, in the end, of the smallest and hardest kind of learning. They did not write down a methodology. They wrote down a name. They chartered a thing that had no precedent in Concord law, a joint medical and defense station on the frontier where wounded beasts and wounded people would be treated by the same hands, and where no V. Harkin would ever again wear a collar, and they put it under the authority of a contract nurse with no rank they could find to give her. So they invented one, and they carved the 4 blunt words the lower decks had made over the door of the place, because there was no other name it could have had. The hand that stayed. Isvit Kaur stayed too. She had known she would, somewhere around the 3rd day, though she had not admitted it to herself until the inquiry, when she had sat in front of 3 commissioners of her own species and told them the truth they did not want and watched them write down that she was compromised. She had thought, when she read that word on the transcript, compromised, that it was meant as an insult, and then she had thought about it longer and had decided to keep it. She was compromised. She had been raised whole and clean and cold, certain that softness was the mark of a lesser make, and a human and a war beast had between them broken that certainty past repair, and she did not want it back. Compromised was the truest thing the Concord had said about her all inquiry. She was going to wear it the way Oscan had learned to wear his one clear second in front of Kor's eye, as the moment she stopped being one thing and started being a better one. She found Wren in the new bay on the last night before the commissioners left, in the quiet part, doing the water. Kor's head was in her lap, and the sponge was pressed to the corner of his mouth, drop and trickle, and the War Alpha's eye was half shut, and the pack was a warm dark ring around them, and the small people slept on their pallets under the drapes the beasts had warmed. "May I sit?" Isvet said, in the doorway, the way Vaughn had said it, and understood as she said it that she was speaking a language she had learned in this room and had not had before she came to it. "There's a crate," Wren said and smiled, tired. "Kor won't mind your pack now. He worked that out days ago. You're the only Sethari he'd let sit this close without me telling him to." Isvet sat inside the ring of the pack, a hand's breadth from a War Alpha that had once emptied a bay with a single sound, and the matron shifted and put her huge scarred head down near the Sethari's knee, and after a moment, hesitant, wondering at herself, Isvet reached out and laid her four-fingered hand flat on the enormous warm skull, and the matron leaned into it, and a purr came up out of that vast chest, and Isvet Kor, who had helped carry a cargo handler's remains into the cold room 2 rotations ago, and believed, then, that this was simply what V. Harkin were, sat in the ring of the free pack with her hand on a war beast's head, and understood that her whole species had been standing at the edge of this the entire time and calling it weakness. "On my world," Isvet said quietly, "when I was young there was a word my instructors used for people like you. It does not translate cleanly. The nearest thing is the one who does not know when to let go. It was not a compliment. It meant a person who lacked the discipline of the clean cut, who held on past the point of usefulness, who wasted themselves on the unsalvageable." She scratched the matron's brow, slow. "I have been thinking that we had the word right and the meaning backward. You are the one who does not know when to let go. And it turns out that is the strongest thing in conquered space, and my people have been afraid of it for our whole history and called our fear a virtue." Wren was quiet for a while, the sponge moving, drop and trickle. "We've got a word like that too," she said. "Back home. For nurses mostly, they call us soft, like it's the opposite of strong." She looked down at the War Alpha in her lap, at the healed seam on his belly and the sealed score on his shoulder and the broken quills grown back straight under a week of a human's comb. "I never minded it. Soft's just what strong looks like when it's aimed at keeping something alive instead of ending it. Takes exactly the same nerve. It's the same muscle, Isvet. It's just pointed the other way." She pressed the sponge to Kor's mouth one more time, and the War Alpha drank, and his eye slid shut. "Vihor told me on the first night the beast was beneath the station's grief, and I was there to keep the floor clean. And he was half right. I was there to keep the floor clean. I just had a different idea than he did about what the floor was for." The pack grew. That was the thing no one had planned for, and the thing that told Wren, more than the charter or the carved name or the invented rank, that the thing she had started was going to outlast her. Because V. Harkin, who had been kept alive by someone who stayed, did not, it turned out, keep the arrangement to themselves. Word moved among the packs, the way word moved among the small people, on a frequency the station's sensors read as background noise and filed and ignored. And across the seasons that followed they came, wounded off the frontier raids, sick, half-dead, dragged in by their own kind or limping in alone, drawn across the cold dark to the one place in conquered space where the doors opened for the written-off, and no beast ever wore a collar. Vaughn met them at the intake dock now. He had learned the water off the hand. It had taken him a long time, and the first several beasts had not chosen him, because he was still in those first tries, a man attempting a method, and the beasts knew the difference. And then one night, alone with a dying young V. Harkin that everyone including Vaughn had privately judged non-viable, the old field warden had stopped attempting anything, and had simply sat down on the cold floor beside it and stayed, all night, expecting nothing. And in the gray of the false dawn the young beast had put its head against his hand, and Ossip Von had wept quietly for the 40 he had broken and could not unbreak, and had finally, at 50-some cycles, become the kind of soldier a beast would choose. But all of that came later: the charter, the grown pack, the old field warden weeping over a young beast in the gray dawn, the frontier learning a new word for strength. On the day the contract crew called Friday, the day the raid came and the Corps ate itself, and 11 free V. Harkin held a dead-end corridor against the Gorn, none of it had been decided yet. There was only a station that had spent 5 days watching a thing it could not explain, and a nurse who had not slept, and a war alpha whose belly wound had knit to a clean pink seam under her hands, and the simple, enormous, uncolorable fact that the beast the hospital had abandoned to die on Monday belonged, by the end of the week, entirely and without appeal, to the one person who had refused to let it. It was Isvet who put words to it, that Friday night, in the quiet after the raid, when the commissioners were still 11 days from arriving, and the charter was still a thing that did not exist, and the future was only a pressure on the air. She was sitting in the ring of the pack with her hand on the matron's brow, and she was watching Wren do the water, and she said it more to herself than to anyone. "Do you understand what happened here this week, contractor? Truly." She did not wait for an answer. On the first night, that animal was Subject Coron 9. It was a tag and a threat rating and a kill count and a line in a disposal log. It belonged to the station, and the station had decided to spend it, and there was nothing in the whole Concord that said the station was wrong. It was property, marked for the incinerator chute, and you were assigned to sweep up after it. Her crest cycled slow, through the color she only ever showed in this room, and by tonight 1 week later it belongs to you, not the way property belongs, the other way, the way that cannot be reassigned or terminated or written off because it was not given by any authority, and so no authority can take it back. You did not requisition him, and you did not break him, and you did not collar him. You stayed with him, and somewhere between Monday's write-off and Friday's raid, without a single form being filed, the most dangerous animal in Concord space stopped belonging to the station that owned it and started belonging to the nurse who stayed. She looked at Wren. "There is no line in our law for what you did. We have laws for property and laws for personnel and laws for hazard fauna, and not one word in the whole Concord Code for a creature that chose. You made a thing the law cannot hold. I do not think you know yet how large that is." Wren pressed the sponge to Cor's mouth, drop and trickle, and the war alpha drank, and his amber eye came half open and found her, and closed again, easy, trusting home. "I know how large it is," Wren said quietly. "I've known since the first morning when he put his head against my hand. I just don't say it out loud, because the minute you say it out loud, somebody like Vihor hears it as a thing to be managed, and somebody like Von hears it as a thing to be fielded, and somebody like your commissioners hears it as a thing to be operationalized, and none of them can hear what it actually is." She scratched between the quills. "It's not a weapon, and it's not an asset, and it's not a technique. It's just a thing that happens when somebody stays. It happens on burn wards. It happens in this bay. It probably happened on your world too, Isvet, 100,000 times, and your people looked at it and called it weakness and cut it out clean, and never once knew what they were throwing away." She looked down at the healed war alpha in her lap. "He's not mine because I made him mine. He's mine because I was the one who was still there when it counted. That's all it ever is. That's all it ever was. You just have to be the one who's still there." They tried once near the end of that first year to make it official, to give the belonging a form, a document, a line in the Concord Code, because the Concord could not finally bear a thing its law could not hold. A clerk arrived from the core worlds with a charter of custody template and a great deal of goodwill, and asked Wren to sign the section that designated her the registered keeper of the V. Harkin pack, and Wren read it, and read it again, and set the stylus down. "I'm not going to sign that," she said, not unkindly. The clerk, who had come a long way and meant well, was baffled. Contractor Halloran, Warden Halloran, it only formalizes what everyone already knows. It registers the pack as belonging to you. It protects them. It protects you. Without it, in the eyes of the law, they're still unregistered hazard fauna, and any officer with the right authority could. They don't belong to me, Wren said. That's the part the form gets wrong. That's the part everybody keeps getting wrong. She looked out through the wide iris of the door with the 4 blunt words carved over it, out into the bay where the pack lay in its loose, warm ring among the sick and the wounded, where the matron was tipping a cup to a feverish bulk child, and Cor was holding the door, and a scored young frontier V-Harkin 3 weeks off a raid was learning, slow, to let a human's hand near its ruined face. I didn't buy them, and I didn't break them, and I didn't win them in a court. They chose me. You can't register a choice, and the second you try, you've turned it back into property, and then it's exactly the thing I spent that whole first week keeping them from being. Coron 9 was registered. He was registered right up until the morning he put his head against my hand, and being registered is what let Vihor sign him over to the incinerator chute. She pushed the template gently back across the desk. No, leave it unwritten. Leave it the one thing in the whole Concord that the law can't hold. That's not a weakness in the arrangement, that's the entire strength of it. The day you can put it on a form is the day somebody can take it away. Let it stay a thing that only exists because we both keep choosing it. That's what makes it real. The clerk went back to the core worlds without a signature, and the Concord code stayed to this day, without a line for what a nurse and a war beast had made on the frontier, and that absence, Isvit would explain it to every new medic who came to train under the carved words, for the rest of her long changed life. That absence was not an oversight. It was the point. Some things are only yours as long as you keep earning them. Put them on paper and they become something the paper owns. Wren Halloran stayed on the frontier for the rest of her short human life, which by Sethari reckoning was not long at all, and by the reckoning of the frontier was the whole of an age. She never took the rank they kept trying to give her. She answered to Warden on the official manifests, because the manifests needed something to write, but the small people who came up the shafts and the beasts who came in off the dark called her by the 4 words, and so did she, in the end, because there had never been a truer name for what she was. She trained the medics who trained the medics. She taught Von the water off the hand, and Von taught it to a corps that no longer wore collars, and the Beast Corps of the frontier became, across her lifetime, the strangest and most feared force in conquered space. Not because its beasts were broken and made to fire, but because they were free and chose to, and there is no countersignal in the whole cruel science of the Gorn for a thing that chose. And the raiders learned, at a cost that broke their frontier ambitions for a generation. Not to come where the free ones were, not to come where she was. Cor never left her side. He healed and grew glossy and then grew old the slow way apex predators grow old, and the broken quills of the first week grew back straight and then went gray at the roots the way her hair did. The two of them aging together on the frontier, the war alpha and the nurse, and the young beasts who came in off the raids would look at the old gray war alpha holding the door of the clinic and could not imagine that he had ever been subject Coron 9, non-viable, marked for the chute. He was simply the first. He was the one who had put his head against her hand on the first gray dawn and made everything after it possible. And every night, until the last one in the quiet part, she did the water, she never stopped, long after he could drink from any trough, long after there was any reason but the one that mattered, the sponge pressed to the corner of his mouth, drop and trickle, the way they had done it on the first night, because that was the night it started, and some things you keep because keeping them is the whole point. On the last night, when the old war alpha's breathing had gone slow and deep and enormous and would not, this time, go on much past the dawn, it was the pack that gathered, and the small people, and Isvit gray-crested and Von bent with cycles, and a whole clinic full of medics who took the 4 carved words as their oath, and had never in their lives let a patient die under a number. And Wren Halloran, old now herself, sat on the floor in the spot that had been hers since the first night, with the great gray head in her lap, and she did not call for a machine, and she did not reach for a chart, and she did not do the clean cut, because that had never once been what she was for. She stayed. She put her hand flat between the gray quills and she scratched, gentle, the way you gentle anything. And she said the thing she had said to a dying beast the entire station had abandoned, a lifetime ago, on a Monday night, in a sealed bay, with her back to the cold plating, and every good sense she owned telling her to walk away. "There you go, old man," Wren said. "I've got you. Nobody dies alone on my floor." And the purr came up one last time through the deck, low and rhythmic and enormous, and the pack pressed close, and the war beast the hospital had thrown away laid the whole trusting weight of his head in the hands of the one who had stayed and let go and belonged to her still.